Hey guys, tonight we're going to do things a little differently. We're going to step far back in time, diving headfirst into worlds where breaking the rules wasn't just a simple fine or a brief time out, but often, well, it was something much more permanent. It's a journey that might feel a bit uncomfortable at times, pulling back the curtain on aspects of human history that were incredibly harsh, incredibly alien to our modern way of thinking about justice and order. As we ease into this tonight, you're going to find yourself transported. One moment you're here, wherever here is for you, maybe curled up in a comfortable chair or lying in bed, and the next, you'll find yourself standing in bustling marketplaces centuries ago, worlds away. You might smell the unfamiliar scents of obsidian dust and fragrant copal incense, feel the cool, hard, volcanic stone beneath your bare feet, maybe squinting a little under a powerful sun you're not used to. And in those moments, just maybe you might wonder if that quick glance you just gave the local official, or that muttered complaint under your breath was technically punishable by something truly severe. Perhaps say not having a face anymore. Or maybe just disappearing. It's a slightly unsettling thought, isn't it? That simple everyday actions we take for granted today could have carried such terrifying weight back then. But hey, leaning into those uncomfortable thoughts is part of understanding these past societies, adding a complex, albeit dark kind of spice to our journey. So before we get completely lost in the mists of time and challenging historical realities, take just a brief moment, if you would, to show your support. Like this video and subscribe to the channel. Please only do so if you genuinely enjoy what I create here, if this is the kind of history that speaks to you and makes you want to explore further. It means a lot, and it truly helps the channel continue. And as always, I love to hear from you. Let me know where you're listening from right now, and what time it is where you are. It's genuinely always fascinating and incredibly cool to see just how far and wide these quiet journeys through history manage to take us together. Now, with those bits aside, let's really settle in. Dim the lights if you like. Maybe turn on a fan for a gentle, soft background hum, or maybe just wrap yourself tighter in your blanket. Take a slow, steadying breath. Release the tensions of your day. Let your shoulders drop, unclench your jaw. We're going to ease into tonight's long journey together. You are safe. You are simply listening, allowing the story to unfold around you, transporting you back in time to observe, to feel, and hopefully to understand just a little bit more about humanity's complex past, particularly when it came to making and breaking the rules. You find yourself transported now. It's not a gentle fade-in or a slow transition. It's more immediate, more like popping into existence right here on a wide, busy causeway. The stone feels smooth yet rugged beneath your feet, still cool from the morning air, despite the sun already climbing fiercely in the sky. This causeway is one of several leading straight out into a vast lake, and rising from that lake, a magnificent, utterly enormous city. This is Tenochtitlan, the beating heart of the mighty Aztec Empire, situated improbably on an island shimmering under that fierce, bright sun. Forget any notions you might have of quaint villages with muddy paths and simple rustic huts. This place is staggering in scale, astonishing in its complexity, and utterly profoundly alien to your modern senses and sensibilities. It's a world built on ingenuity, faith, and an unyielding social structure. As you stand there taking in the view, the sensory details begin to press in on you. You can smell the rich, earthy scent of the lake itself, a mix of fresh water, and perhaps something deeper, organic. This mingles with the smoky, aromatic perfume of countless cooking fires already sending tendrils of white smoke into the morning airwood and charcoal burning. And perhaps, just perhaps, a very faint hint of something. A bit fishy, understandable, given you are literally surrounded by water and dependent on it for food. You are not alone on this causeway. Far from it. You are walking among thousands upon thousands of people. They flow around you like a river of humanity. You see individuals dressed in elaborate feather headdresses and brightly colored cotton cloaks, likely high-ranking nobles. Beside them, commoners wear more simple attire, often made from maguey fiber cloaks of plainer colors. You see merchants, their voices rising and falling in rhythmic calls, hawking their wares. Porters carrying impossibly heavy loads trot by. Everyone seems to be moving with a purpose, bustling towards the city gates, or outward onto the causeways, everyone seemingly knowing their place within this intricate moving tapestry. And place is everything here. Absolutely everything. Your station in life isn't just a matter of social circles or economic standing as you might understand it today. It was a defining, inescapable reality that determined nearly every aspect of your existence, right down to how the law saw you, judged you, and treated you if you stepped out of line. Aztec society wasn't exactly what you'd call a free-for-all. It was structured intensely so. Think of it as a rigid, towering pyramid. At the very peak of this structure sat the Huey Tlatoani, the great speaker, the emperor himself. He wasn't just a political leader. He was considered the earthly representative of the gods, almost a living deity in his own right. His word was in many ways law imbued with divine authority. Below the Tlatoani were the nobles, the Pipiltin. This was the elite class. They held significant power, controlled vast amounts of land, were educated in special schools, served as high-ranking officials and military leaders, and had access to luxuries like the best cacao beans, which, as we'll see, were almost like currency. Their status afforded them immense privilege, and as we'll discover, sometimes different rules applied to them compared to the vast majority of the population. Then you have the broad base of that pyramid, the commoners known as the Makwalton. These were the farmers who worked the chinampas, those incredible floating gardens providing food for the city. They were the artisans who crafted the beautiful pottery textiles and obsidian tools. They were the warriors who fought the empire's battles, expanding its reach and bringing back tribute and captives. The Makwalton were without question the absolute backbone of the empire. Their labor, their production, their military service, it all kept the elaborate structure functioning. And at the very bottom, unfortunately, were several layers of disadvantaged groups. There were a class of serfs or bound laborers tied to the land or the service of a noble. And tragically, there were slaves. Slavery in the Aztec Empire wasn't entirely race-based or solely a matter of birthright, although children of slaves could inherit their status. More often, slaves were captives taken during warfare. A primary purpose of Aztec conflict was securing sacrificial victims and people to fill this labor pool. But people could also fall into slavery through desperation, selling themselves or even family members like children into servitude to pay off debts, avoid starvation, or escape punishment for certain crimes. It was a stark, often brutal lowest rung of society with virtually no rights. Life for the commoner, while physically demanding and constantly subject to the needs of the state and nobility, was structured and had its own form of organization. You belonged to a kalpuli. Think of a kalpuli as more than just a neighborhood. It was a complex socio-economic and political unit, often based on kinship, a kind of clan or district. The kalpuli collectively owned land that was distributed among its members for farming. Each kalpuli had its own chief or kalpulik and a council of elders. This kalpuli unit was incredibly important. It served as your social safety net, providing some measure of support in times of need. It was your basic military unit, raising soldiers from its ranks. It was your local administrative hub, responsible for collecting taxes and tribute from its members. Taxes usually paid not in coin or paper money because that concept as we know it didn't exist here. Instead, taxes were paid in goods, mounds of maize and beans, bundles of textiles, intricately worked feather cloaks, or other valuable items. And yes, as we mentioned earlier, cacao beans were incredibly valuable, serving almost as a form of currency for smaller transactions, making you idly wonder if, for someone with limited resources, paying for things ever felt like agonizingly handing over the components of what could have been a very expensive bittersweet chocolate bar. Crucially for our focus tonight, the Kalpuli Council also handled minor disputes among its own members. This was the first, most local layer of justice. Justice in the Aztec world wasn't a single unified system like you might picture a Supreme Court or national police force today. It was layered deliberately, so directly reflecting that intense social hierarchy. Minor squabbles, the kinds of arguments you might have with your neighbor anywhere in the world, perhaps over who has the right to irrigation water from a particular ditch, or maybe about a mischievous pig that wandered where it absolutely should not have gone and damaged someone's crops. These everyday disputes might often be handled right there within your own kalpuli. The local council of elders, or the kalpulik would hear the case, listen to both sides, and mediate or issue a ruling based on customary law and the community's best interest. Think of it as neighborhood mediation, or a local peace court Aztec style, handled by respected community members who knew the parties involved and the local situation intimately. But if the issue was more serious, maybe something the kalpuli couldn't resolve, or if it involved parties from different kalpuli districts preventing easy local resolution. Or significantly, if a noble was somehow involved either as a victim perpetrator, or even just as a witness whose status lent weight to the matter. In such cases, the case moved up the chain. It escalated to the higher levels of the Aztec legal system. And yes, despite often being unfairly depicted simply as a brutal, sacrifice-obsessed society, the Aztecs, like many advanced civilizations, did have a sophisticated legal system, with various levels of courts and judicial officials. This is a crucial mainstream historical fact about their governance. There wasn't just one court, but a hierarchy. For commoners, some of the most important courts were located in Tenochtitlan itself, presided over by professional judges, who were specifically appointed by the emperor. These weren't priests or military leaders primarily. They were officials dedicated to administering the law. Nobles, because their status was so distinct, had their own separate courts to handle disputes and crimes among the elite. This really highlights that this wasn't mob rule or a chief making arbitrary decisions under a tree on a whim. There was a formal structure, established procedures, specific places where cases were heard, and dedicated officials whose job it was to hear arguments and pass judgments. They even had mechanisms that historians sometimes describe as being akin to appellate courts, where it was theoretically possible to appeal a decision made in a lower court. Though truthfully, if you were truly at the very bottom rung of Aztec society, perhaps a bound laborer or even worse, a slave, accessing those higher levels of appeal or having your voice truly heard was likely an incredibly difficult, perhaps near impossible hurdle. Your journey through the legal system, like your life journey, was heavily dictated by where you stood on that pyramid. Walking through the vast marketplace of Tenochtitlan, now the great market of Tlatelolco, a spectacle of commerce almost beyond imagination for its time, you see individuals wearing distinctive garb. These are officials identifiable by their clothing or insignias, moving through the crowds, keeping an eye on things. They weren't merely there to direct foot traffic or settle minor vendor disagreements on the spot, though they might do that. They were crucial enforcers of public order and morality, and their presence served as a constant visible reminder that judgment for certain crimes could be terrifyingly swift. There wasn't typically a long, drawn-out process involving large juries, endless legal maneuvering, and appeals that stretched on for months or years, as you might imagine or perhaps dread depending on your experience with modern legal systems. Justice, especially for many serious or even some surprisingly minor infractions, was often quick, decisive, and delivered with stark, undeniable finality. And frankly, it was frequently brutal by modern standards. Historians still debate the primary philosophical goals of the Aztec legal system. Was its main purpose retribution, simply making the criminal pay for their misdeeds in kind, an eye for an eye? Was it primarily about deterrence, making such terrifying examples of wrongdoers that it scared everyone else straight, discouraging any thoughts of stepping out of line? Or was the overriding objective simply maintaining that complex, fragile social order, ensuring that the vast, intricate machinery of their empire didn't grind to a halt due to unchecked crime or disruption? Probably the truth is a complex mix of all three objectives, delivered with a very heavy, unmistakable dose of don't even think about challenging the rules or stepping out of your place. The very presence of the officials, the known swiftness of punishment, it all contributed to a constant atmosphere of watchfulness. Now here's a little quirky tidbit, something that stands out and feels unexpectedly modern, or at least pragmatic in such a seemingly harsh system. One of the more unusual and interesting aspects of their justice system involved the concept of restitution, particularly for theft. If someone stole something from you, the punishment often involved not just whatever physical or potentially fatal penalty was decreed for the act of theft itself, but it also almost always required the perpetrator to return the stolen item to the victim and pay extra compensation. Sometimes this compensation was quite substantial, potentially requiring the thief to pay back double the value of what they had taken. It's almost like an ancient, brutal version of punitive damages, except instead of someone writing you a check that might bounce, the compensation was delivered in tangible goods, maybe precious featherwork, large sacks of maize, valuable textiles, or bundles of cacao beans. Or if the convicted thief was too poor to provide goods, there are accounts suggesting they might be sentenced to temporary servitude for the victim, essentially agreeing to become their servant for a specified period to work off the debt incurred by their crime. You can imagine the slightly awkward transaction. Yes, I confess I stole your most prized ceremonial cloak. Here it is. And to compensate for your distress and the trouble, I suppose I will weed your fields and repair your fence for a week. Deal. A uniquely Aztec payment plan, certainly. The severity of the punishment depended heavily on the specific crime committed. Yes, that was fundamental. But it also depended crucially, and starkly on your social standing, on where you were located on that social pyramid. A noble one of the Pippleton might receive a formal reprimand from their peers, perhaps a heavy fine levied in valuable goods or a period of banishment for an offense. That same offense committed by a commoner, a ***, might result in public humiliation, severe corporal punishment, or even execution. This was fundamentally not *** a system based on equality before the law as many modern democracies strive for. It was explicitly based on maintaining the established social order, reinforcing the privileges and different standards that applied to the elite. Your status wasn't just a label. It was a determinant of your legal fate. You, as a visitor from the future plopped into this reality without a clear place or status, are kind of in a peculiar and precarious spot. You don't fit neatly into any of their well-defined categories. You're clearly not Aztec. You have no lineage here. No Calpuli, no lord, no specific defined place, which honestly, in a society built so rigidly on knowing your place, might be more fundamentally dangerous than just about anything else you could do. Better to keep your head down. Better to observe, stay quiet, and try very, very hard not to look too utterly bewildered by everything you see and hear. Blending in seems like the safest strategy by far. You realize as you walk, as you observe, that simply existing in this incredibly structured society requires a constant low-level hum of awareness. You have to be acutely mindful of the rules spoken and unspoken, and vividly aware of your lack of any defined place within them. The air doesn't just feel charged with the energy of the vibrant, sprawling city. It also feels thick with the ever-present possibility of swift, decisive, and potentially very severe punishment for transgressing. You see people going about their lives, interacting with vendors, buying goods, selling their crafts, praying at the smaller shrines scattered throughout the market area. But beneath all this visible activity, there's a palpable underlying sense of caution among the common folk. Nobody wants to draw the wrong kind of attention from an official, an elder, or worse, a noble. And as you'll soon discover, drawing that wrong kind of attention, or even just attention you didn't intend, could happen for reasons you'd find incredibly, almost ridiculously minor by today's standards. Small things. Almost invisible things. Think on that for a moment. Maybe trying to appreciate the layers of societal control at play, if you can, in this environment that makes even the most confident person feel vulnerable. You are navigating the crowded causeway, now moving deeper into the heart of the island city of Tenochtitlan. The sheer volume of sounds presses in on you. The low murmur of thousands of conversations in Nahuatl, the shouts of vendors, the padding of bare feet, and the slap of sandals on the stone, the occasional calls of officials. That feeling of caution we just talked about from the marketplace. Yeah, it's not just a transient feeling, a vibe that you can shake off. It quickly registers as a fundamental, essential survival instinct in this place. Because while the truly big, dramatic, headline-grabbing crimes, like treason or murder, certainly had equally, if not more dramatic and horrific consequences, it was often the smaller slip-ups, the seemingly insignificant actions that you wouldn't even spare a second thought about in your modern life that could nonetheless land you in deeply serious trouble here. You might, for instance, stub your bare toe on a loose stone in the causeway, and instinctively mutter a sharp complaint under your breath about the uneven paving, then freeze mid-sentence, suddenly paranoid. Could complaining about the state of public works technically be construed as some form of sedition? Was it a capital offense to express dissatisfaction with civic maintenance? Spoiler alert? While probably not a capital asterisk offense. In most cases, public displays of disrespect towards authority figures or systems were definitely frowned upon, and it highlights the need for that constant caution, better safe than finding out the hard way right. Let's delve into some of those minor offenses that carry disproportionate weight in Aztec law. Public drunkenness is a particularly illustrative example, a really good place to start. Now, the Aztecs weren't complete abstainers from alcohol. They had pulque, a traditional fermented drink made from the sap of the agave plant, and it held significant cultural and religious importance. Pulque was consumed often in large quantities during religious ceremonies, important festivals, and other communal events. It was woven into the fabric of their social and spiritual life. However, there were incredibly strict rules surrounding who was permitted to drink pulque, and just as importantly, when they were allowed to drink it, particularly in public. Generally speaking, public drunkenness, especially for commoners and even more so for young people, was considered a very big no-no. It wasn't just a social embarrassment, it was seen as a breakdown of self-control, a potential catalyst for disorder, and a disregard for expected behavior. There were exceptions. Elderly people, those considered elders who had reached a certain respectable age, often cited in historical sources as being around 70, though historians still debate how strictly enforced that age threshold was, perhaps serving more as a guideline for distinguishing respected elder status versus just a standard older person, were typically granted more leeway to enjoy pulque even occasionally to the point of intoxication, seemingly as a sort of privilege or perk earned through a long life of contributions and adherence to social norms. But for a young person, a commoner still finding their way in the world, to be caught stumbling around clearly and visibly drunk in public, that was unequivocally a serious offense. The punishment for such an act wasn't just waking up with a splitting headache and facing the private embarrassment of your friends and family the next morning. For a first offense of public drunkenness by a young commoner, the punishment might be a significant form of public humiliation. One commonly cited example was having your head shaved. Now, okay, compared to some other punishments, losing your hair isn't permanently debilitating or fatal. But in a society where appearance and social conformity were important, it was a highly visible mark of shame, something everyone would see. It's certainly survivable, but far from pleasant. But what about repeat offenders? Or what if someone of higher status, a noble for example, was caught drunk in public? Here the rules shifted significantly again, reflecting the unequal nature of the system. For nobles, public intoxication was viewed as particularly egregious. Not just a personal failing, but a profound failure of aristocratic duty and dignity. Nobles were expected to embody virtue, self-control, and responsible leadership. Their public behavior was under constant scrutiny. Being caught publicly drunk wasn't just a lapse. It was seen as a deep betrayal of their social class's responsibilities and reputation. The consequences could be incredibly severe for an inebriated noble, potentially leading to public disgrace, loss of their significant status, the confiscation of their property and wealth, or in some cases, even execution. Talk about a fundamental buzzkill, taking a hangover from a temporary discomfort to a permanently fatal condition. You suddenly feel a profound surge of gratitude for living in a time and place where enjoying a few drinks on a Friday night doesn't come with the looming threat of losing your social title, your wealth, or your actual head. Minor theft was another area where the severity of punishment could seem highly disproportionate to the perceived value of the stolen goods. Steal just a few ears of maize from your neighbor's field. Perhaps you were hungry. Perhaps you were desperate. The legal consequences weren't necessarily limited to just having to return them and paying double value as part of that restitution concept we discussed earlier. You could very well also face direct, painful physical punishment, perhaps being severely beaten right there, or brought before local officials for corporal correction. Steal something considered more valuable, a precious feather, a jade bead, a well-made tool, or be caught as a repeat offender even of petty theft, and the consequences escalated remarkably quickly. While not technically a minor theft, stealing from the marketplace itself appears to have been considered an especially risky, dangerous move. There are accounts suggesting that if you were caught shoplifting, or perhaps more accurately market lifting right there in the vast plaza, judgment could be meted out with terrifying swiftness and finality on the spot. Some accounts suggest that being caught in the act of theft within the marketplace could potentially lead to immediate summary execution by stoning or beating carried out by angry market guards, or even enraged bystanders with the sanction of local officials. Imagine trying to discreetly pocket a small shiny piece of polished obsidian or a valuable handful of cacao beans and being spotted. The next thing you know, people around you aren't just gasping in disapproval. They're literally picking up stones from the ground. Talk about a form of curbside pickup gone incredibly lethally wrong. It instills a powerful lesson. Keep your hands off what isn't yours, especially when everyone is watching. Gambling was yet another common source of potential trouble and interaction with the legal system. The Aztecs enjoyed various games. They played *patoli*, a game akin to Parcheesi or Ludo, using marked beans as dice. They also participated in the famous Mesoamerican ball game known in its Aztec form as ulama. While the ball game held deep ceremonial and religious significance, gambling on the outcome was also a popular practice. Engaging in gambling itself wasn't strictly or universally illegal at all times, especially during festivals. But excessive or obsessive gambling, the kind that led a person to completely ruin their family's finances, amass huge debts they couldn't repay, or worst of all, led them to sell themselves or family members into slavery to cover losses. That sort of destructive gambling behavior was deeply frowned upon by the authorities and could absolutely incur significant legal penalties. Losing your belongings, your social standing, your future prospects, and even your very freedom over a game played with beans or a bouncing rubber ball seems like an exceptionally harsh outcome. It highlights a societal concern not just with the act of gambling, but with its potentially ruinous consequences on the family unit and an individual's ability to contribute to society. Perhaps one of the more surprising petty offenses, or at least actions that could lead to serious trouble, was related to speech and public behavior. Malicious gossip spreading rumors that unfairly damaged another person's hard-earned reputation, or generally acting as a persistent public nuisance, could draw serious unwanted attention from officials or community elders. While there thankfully wasn't likely a specific codified law explicitly against being annoying or being a loudmouth actions that clearly disrupted the social fabric, undermined community harmony, or publicly disrespected important individuals, elders or the gods themselves could absolutely have consequences. One historical tidbit, perhaps slightly fringe, but often cited to illustrate the expected level of public decorum, suggests that even seemingly minor acts of disrespect, like interrupting someone of important status in public, or speaking out of turn in formal settings, might lead to a swift, immediate, and unpleasant physical correction from an observing official, or even a member of the aggrieved party's retinue. Imagine getting smacked, perhaps upside the head, or given a sharp, painful shove just for rudely butting into a conversation you weren't a part of, especially if the person you interrupted was someone of high standing. Your levels of social anxiety, if they weren't already through the roof in this intense environment, would likely skyrocket. Every word you chose, every glance you gave, every interaction carried potential weight, and the risk of misunderstanding or offense in a society that valued order and respect so profoundly. Another area that was surprisingly regulated was dress and personal appearance. The Aztecs had specific sumptuary laws. These were laws dictating what people of different social classes were permitted or forbidden to wear. Commoners, the *Meshualtan*, for instance, were typically restricted in the types of materials and adornments they could use. They couldn't wear certain kinds of finely woven cotton cloaks, cotton being a luxury item, nor could they use specific precious adornments made from materials like jade gold, or certain rare and vibrantly colored feathers. These were reserved exclusively for nobles or high-ranking warriors. Wearing clothing or jewelry that was explicitly above your defined social station wasn't just a cultural faux pas or a simple fashion mistake. It was seen as a deliberate attempt to misrepresent your social status, to put on airs, or deceive. This was considered an offense against the established order itself, and it was absolutely punishable, sometimes severely. You glanced down instinctively at your modern clothing, maybe jeans and a t-shirt, perhaps a comfortable jacket, and wonder for a split second if polyester blend is an emperor-only fabric. Probably not. But the thought is there, underscoring just how pervasive the rules were down to the very clothes on your back. Reinforcing these laws, particularly for minor offenses, was the powerful tool of public shaming. This is a key mainstream historical fact about Aztec punishment. It wasn't always about imprisonment, or even just physical pain. Public shaming was a very common and deliberate punishment for a wide variety of lesser offenses. This could take the form of forced labor performed in a public space, like sweeping the busy marketplace, where everyone could see you performing the humbling task. Or, as mentioned earlier, with public drunkenness, more directly humiliating acts like having your head conspicuously shaved in the town square. The primary idea behind public shaming wasn't solely about inflicting physical discomfort on the individual, but making a very clear, visible example of them in front of the entire community. It was a living lesson for everyone else present, starkly reinforcing the social norms, reminding people of the boundaries, and strongly deterring others from contemplating similar misdeeds, knowing the public disgrace that would follow. Your personal humiliation served a broader societal purpose. Historians continue to debate the degree to which the severity of these punishments for minor offenses was truly and uniformly applied across the empire and for all individuals. Did the strict penalties really come down hard every single time someone was caught whispering gossip or wearing the wrong cloak? Or was there significant discretion allowed to local officials, the Kalpuli chief, or even the judges, permitting them to consider circumstances, the individual's past behavior, or perhaps their connections? Were these harsh penalties more of a constant, credible threat? Designed primarily to keep the general population tightly in line, with leniency or alternative solutions sometimes shown depending on the specific situation. It is difficult with the historical records available to definitively say how often the very harshest prescribed penalty for a minor offense was actually carried out versus a less severe discretionary alternative being chosen. But the threat of that severe penalty was unquestionably very real and ever-present. As you walk through the marketplace, winding your way between stalls laden with pottery, vivid dyes, shiny obsidian blades, unfamiliar fruits and vegetables piled high, you feel the weight of this awareness. You might instinctively resist the urge to absent-mindedly pocket a fascinating-looking shiny piece of obsidian. Even if the value seems low to you, the potential legal cost feels catastrophically high. Certainly not worth the potential loss of a hand if market theft was punished that severely. You also consciously try not to talk too loudly, perhaps keeping your voice low, and avoid any unnecessary, potentially misinterpreted gestures. Laughing too boisterously, appearing too idle, looking lost and confused. You wonder nervously if simply being conspicuously different or drawing any attention at all could somehow be perceived as offensive or disruptive. It seems like a society where vigilance wasn't just a good idea, it was absolutely essential for survival. Every step you take, every word you utter, every glance you cast, seems to carry potential unpredictable weight in this world governed by intricate rules and swift consequences. And these, remember, were just the minor things, the small offenses that could trip you up. Things are about to get considerably, starkly, terrifyingly less minor as we move on. Sleep well on asterisk. That asterisk thought, probably not yet. You're still absorbing the sheer scale, the intense order, and yes, the pervasive undertone of caution within Tenochtitlan. The low, steady hum of the crowd is a constant presence overlaid with those distinct foreign scents. The shimmering light on the lake waters visible at the end of streets, and that unshakable awareness that stepping even slightly out of line, especially if you weren't born into a position of privilege, could have deeply disproportionate and often devastating consequences. We've touched on how even seemingly small actions like public intoxication or spreading bothersome gossip could land you in very hot water indeed. Knowing this, you naturally begin to contemplate the really serious stuff. What happened if you committed a crime that wasn't just a minor social annoyance, a transgression of expected behavior, or a simple case of petty theft? What happened if your actions struck fundamentally at the very heart of the Aztec order, their carefully constructed social fabric, their relationship with the divine, or even took a life? Well, brace yourself, because the jump in severity here from the minor offenses to the major ones is not a gradual step. It's like going from a gentle nudge pushing you slightly off course to being violently thrown off the side of one of their towering pyramids. Major crimes, the kind of deeds that would send profound shivers down the spine of even a hardened Aztec warrior who faced death on the battlefield regularly, were met with punishments that were delivered with incredible speed, unyielding brutality, and horrifying finality. We are now talking about the truly heavy hitters in the Aztec legal system. Crimes like intentional homicide, treason against the state or the divine ruler, major theft of high-value goods or from important places, and certain unforgivable acts of sacrilege against the gods or their temples. Murder, as in virtually every organized human society, was considered an exceptionally grave offense. Intentionally taking the life of another human being was understood as a direct, profound violation of the peace, the established order, and the cosmic balance that Mott, or the Aztec equivalent, which focused intensely on maintaining balance between the human world and the divine forces, required. The punishment for intentional homicide in the Aztec Empire was almost invariably death for the killer. There wasn't typically room for long debates over motive-nuanced degrees of guilt, or complex sentencing considerations in most straightforward murder cases. If you were found guilty of intentionally taking someone else's life, your own life was considered forfeit. It was a fundamental balancing of the scales. A life taken required a life in return, seen through their legal lens. The method of execution could vary depending on the specific circumstances or perhaps the status of the victim or perpetrator, though for commoners it wasn't designed to be a painless or dignified departure. It could involve different methods, sometimes hanging, sometimes stoning where stones were thrown until death occurred, or sometimes being clubbed to death with a heavy wooden club. The method chosen might carry symbolic weight, but the outcome was the same. Such executions were often carried out in public or semi-public places. They weren't hidden away behind walls. They were grim, unavoidable displays intended not only to punish the individual, but to serve as a shocking visceral deterrent to anyone else contemplating similar violence. Imagine for a chilling moment walking towards the central parts of the city and seeing something like that occurring in the distance, maybe silhouetted against a temple wall. It would most definitely put an immediate and profound damper on any sightseeing plans or lighthearted enjoyment of the urban atmosphere. Treason, an act of disloyalty or betrayal against the emperor or the state, was arguably the most feared and severely punished crime in the entire Aztec legal code. And its definition could be surprisingly broad, encompassing more than just open rebellion. Plotting in secret against the emperor, or key officials attempting to incite rebellion among the populace or distant provinces, or even collaborating with enemy tribes or states that were constant military threats to the empire. These were all considered acts of treason. Given the immensely centralized nature of the Aztec Empire built around the godlike figure of the Tlatoani, and seen as the manifestation of their will on earth, any perceived threat to that structure, any challenge to the authority of the state or its ruler was viewed not just as a political attack, but almost as an assault on the cosmic order itself, a defiance of the divine plan. The punishment for treason wasn't typically confined to just the individual found guilty. This was a key element designed to discourage any form of sedition root and branch. The consequences could chillingly extend to their entire family. Sometimes the perpetrator's parents, siblings, spouse, and even young children might be executed alongside them, or their entire family lineage might be condemned to permanent slavery. Their property would invariably be confiscated by the state, and their name and legacy might even be deliberately erased from public records, their lineage essentially wiped from the social memory as much as possible. This horrific extension of punishment wasn't just about punishing the primary guilty party. It was an ultimate devastating warning to everyone about the unimaginable cost of disloyalty, even contemplating it. The bond of kinship, normally a source of strength in the Kalpuli, could become a terrifying liability. You find yourself walking just a little straighter now, instinctively trying to appear completely innocuous, perhaps giving a polite nod to an official in a feathered cloak walking nearby. Feeling very, very loyal all of a sudden, to everyone. Major theft, particularly the theft of highly valuable goods, significant amounts of tribute, or anything taken from sacred places like temples or royal storehouses, also routinely carried the death penalty. This wasn't simply seen as taking property. Stealing a precious jade mask used in rituals, looting a royal treasury containing generations of accumulated tribute, or taking sacred objects from a temple, were acts of profound disrespect challenging the state's wealth, the nobility's privilege, or the power of the gods. These acts went far beyond personal need. They were seen as undermining the fundamental structures of Aztec society. This contrasts sharply, you notice, with the potentially less severe though still harsh punishments we discussed for petty theft of small items or agricultural produce. It powerfully highlights how the value of the stolen goods, the location from which they were stolen, and critically the status of the victim directly influenced the severity of the legal consequence. It's almost like they had different tiers of larceny where grand theft ceremony supplies, or unauthorized precious feather removal, definitely fell into the swift execution category. Okay, they didn't have llamas in the Aztec world for grand theft llama, but you absolutely get the symbolic idea of severe punishment for high-value, high-status targets. Sacrilege, the act of offending the gods, disrespecting sacred objects or places, or interfering with important religious ceremonies, could also be punished by death. Religion was not separate from daily life for the Aztecs. It was absolutely interwoven with every single aspect from agriculture and warfare to law and governance. Maintaining the favor of the powerful, often demanding gods through ritual sacrifice and proper conduct, was seen as absolutely paramount, not just for individual well-being, but for the survival of the entire empire. Disrupting a vital ritual that ensured the sun would rise, or the crops would grow, stealing idols or offerings from a temple, or publicly speaking blasphemy against the divine powers. These acts were seen as posing a direct threat to the stability of the cosmos and the community's relationship with forces that controlled their destiny. The priests, who held immense power and influence in Aztec society, would certainly ensure that divine law was enforced in the earthly realm, and enforced with horrifying, absolute finality. You probably want to be extra careful where you walk, where you touch, and what you say about anything remotely connected to their complex pantheon of deities. Let's step back briefly for a mainstream historical fact point. Consistent with their use of public displays for lesser punishments, the Aztecs also often had designated places of execution for major crimes. This was frequently a specific scaffold, platform, or site located within or near the major urban centers, certainly within Tenochtitlan. Public executions were not hidden away. They were grimly public spectacles intended to serve as immensely powerful deterrents, visible reminders to the assembled populace of the absolute authority of the state and the terrifying, unnegotiable consequences of breaking its most serious foundational laws. Seeing such an event would embed a lesson far more profoundly than any written decree. There's a quirky or fringe tidbit, or perhaps just a debated aspect of their legal system concerning major crimes like homicide, which involves the concept that might be loosely termed blood guilt or the rights of the victim's family. While the state undoubtedly prosecuted murder as a public crime requiring public justice, there appears to have been room in asterisk some asterisk historical accounts and interpretations for the victim's family to play a significant role in demanding satisfaction or even potentially influencing the final outcome in specific, perhaps less clear-cut situations. While the state demanded the killer's life, some sources hint at possibilities where, with the approval of officials or elders, the victim's family might agree to a different resolution, perhaps involving the killer, or even a member of the killer's family being enslaved permanently to the victim's family as a form of lifelong compensation and redress. Historians still argue about whether this was a formal established part of the legal process for intentional homicide applied regularly, or if it was a more informal traditional practice applied in highly specific or exceptional circumstances, perhaps related to accidental killings or disputes where intent was debated. But the mere idea that a human life violently taken could potentially be paid for with the permanent servitude of the perpetrator or their kin is certainly remarkably different from modern notions of justice and punishment. So you quickly learn that navigating the bustling, complex world of Tenochtitlan wasn't just a matter of being careful to avoid those ubiquitous petty offenses that could get you shaved or beaten. It was about living your life every single day, trying your utmost to steer completely clear of the big asterisk stuff. The fundamental transgressions that could not only end your journey in this historical exploration abruptly, but end your very existence here, often in horrifying ways. You try to blend into the crowds even more effectively, now making yourself as utterly unremarkable as is humanly possible in your strange foreign clothes. You walk past vibrant market stalls that assault your senses with sights and smells. Exotic fruits and vegetables, finely crafted pottery with geometric designs, bundles of soft woven textiles, glimmering blades crafted from obsidian rock. The air, in addition to the cooking fires and the lake, is thick with the scent of copal incense constantly burning and drifting lazily from countless smaller shrines and towering temples dedicated to powerful gods. There's the ceaseless murmur of thousands upon thousands of voices, the rhythmic, distant thudding sounds of construction, or maybe drums, all contributing to the feeling of a city intensely vibratingly alive. And yet, simultaneously you feel its terrifying fragility, the knife-edge existence, keenly aware of how easily that life could be extinguished or devastated if you happen to step on the wrong metaphorical or perhaps even literal toe. In this unforgiving environment, it's vibrant, yes, but safe. That word doesn't seem to fit very well here. Beyond the obvious devastating capital crimes we've discussed, things like murder, treason, or grand sacrilege, Aztec law also reached deep into people's personal lives, regulating conduct with a strictness that modern eyes find astonishing, particularly when it came to relationships, sex, and adherence to carefully defined social boundaries. Their society placed an immense fundamental emphasis on order at every level, from the state down to the family unit. Family honor, maintaining a family's reputation, and keeping clear, distinct lines between social classes, and enforcing appropriate circumspect behaviors for individuals within those classes. These were not minor points. They were cornerstones of the social structure. And violating these incredibly important social and moral norms, especially those perceived as transgressions related to sex and marriage, could also very often result in punishments that seem shocking and exceptionally severe when viewed through a modern Western lens that emphasizes personal freedom and privacy in such matters. Adultery, for instance, engaging in consensual sexual relations outside of one's marriage, was considered not just a moral failing, but a capital offense in Aztec society. This wasn't a matter dealt with simply by a divorce or a social scandal. It was a crime against the state and the community, disrupting the fundamental unit of marriage and perceived social order. If a man and a woman were caught engaging in adultery and brought before the law, both individuals, regardless of their marital status, being the wronged party or the one committing the act, could face execution. The method of execution for adultery was often death by stoning, a public and brutal end that left no doubt about the consequences. Or sometimes death by strangulation. The fact that it was a matter of public legal action, often culminating in public execution, underscored that this wasn't treated as merely a private indiscretion between the individuals involved, or even solely as a private matter between them and their spouses. It was seen as a fundamental disruption to the societal order, a serious threat to the stability and sanctity of the marriage unit, which, as we mentioned, was a core foundation of the Calpulli system and the broader empire's structure. The sheer severity of this punishment, a life sentence effectively, for what many modern cultures view differently powerfully, highlights the intense importance the Aztecs placed on marital fidelity and the overall stability and proper functioning of family units. It makes you consider the relative complexities of modern relationships and suddenly feel incredibly grateful that dating apps, or even just casual romantic encounters, didn't exist back then. Imagine the crushing legal risks involved in what many today see as relatively minor social missteps. Incest was another behavior that the Aztecs defined clearly and punished with the utmost severity, also carrying the death penalty. The definition of incest was quite broad, extending to include sexual relationships between not just immediate family members like parent and child or siblings, but often including relationships between relatively close relatives within the broader kinship structures. This absolute taboo aligns with prohibitions found in many cultures throughout human history, reflecting a deep-seated and widely held aversion. Similarly, specific, clearly defined forms of sexual assault or rape were also punished severely, often with death for the perpetrator. The law aimed to protect individuals, particularly women, and the vulnerable from these acts, reflecting a recognition of the harm caused. However, as with other aspects of Aztec justice, the application of these laws, particularly those related to sex and relationships, wasn't always straightforward, and an individual's social status could once again potentially play a mitigating or sometimes aggravating role. While commoners caught committing adultery might face swift summary execution as the standard and readily applied punishment, the consequences for nobles involved in such a scandal might occasionally be different, though still incredibly severe and life-altering within their privileged class. Some historical accounts and scholarly interpretations suggest that while execution was indeed the standard penalty written into the codes, there could be instances where a noble involved might face a horrific public disgrace, a devastating loss of their high status and all the privileges that came with it, perhaps perpetual banishment from their home city or province instead of immediate physical execution. Although it seems important to note if the adultery involved a high-ranking priest, an incredibly important political figure, or was particularly scandalous, execution was almost certainly still the guaranteed outcome for a noble as well. Historians continue to debate whether these observed differences or nuances in punishment based on social status were part of the officially codified legal policy representing different laws for different classes, or if it was simply the de facto reality of powerful individuals being able to use influence, connections, or perhaps even bribes to influence the application of justice and punishments, even when the written laws were clear. There were also formal laws regulating marriage itself, and importantly, the process of divorce. While marriage was the ideal and fundamental social unit, divorce was possible within Aztec society. It wasn't an absolute unbreakable bond unto death, but it certainly wasn't a casual affair undertaken lightly on a whim. Grounds for divorce recognized in their legal social framework included things like irremediable incompatibility between spouses, sterility, the inability to have children which was deeply valued, or clear cases of severe mistreatment or cruelty within the marriage. However, obtaining a divorce typically required a formal process, often involving bringing the case before community elders, the Kalpuli Council, or designated legal officials who would hear evidence and make a ruling on whether to grant the dissolution of the marriage. Furthermore, behaviors like the unjustifiable abandonment of one's family, spouse, or children were viewed as serious violations of the social contract and could lead to severe penalties, including forced labor for the community or even enslavement. Marriage was a complex social and legal arrangement often negotiated and agreed upon between families rather than solely the individuals involved, and deliberately breaking the rules and responsibilities around it carried significant enforceable repercussions from the broader community and the legal system. Here's a quirky or perhaps fringe tidbit regarding social laws, especially those with a sexual or moral component. There is some fragmented evidence or interpretation suggesting that certain sexual acts considered unnatural or non-procreative within the Aztec worldview, while perhaps not always routinely or publicly prosecuted with the same zeal as adultery or incest, were nonetheless viewed with intense social disapproval and were strongly associated with bad omens, spiritual contamination, or divine displeasure. While historical documentation on specific legal punishments for such acts might be less extensive and definitive, compared to the clear-cut death penalty for adultery or incest, the strong moral code surrounding sexual behavior was undeniable, strictly upheld, and deeply intertwined with religious beliefs about natural order and divine will. These weren't just private lifestyle choices. They could have spiritual and social implications recognized by the community. Moving to another clear mainstream historical fact point. The enforcement of laws related to sexual conduct and proper behavior was particularly strict, notably among young people before marriage. Premarital chastity, especially for young women, was incredibly highly valued within Aztec society as a matter of personal and family honor and preparation for marriage. Young people weren't left unsupervised to navigate burgeoning relationships on their own. Public officials, community elders, and particularly family members kept a close and constant watch on the behavior of young men and women. Any perceived impropriety, any sign of what was deemed inappropriate interaction or deviation from expected conduct could lead to investigation and potentially swift punishment. Often this punishment for young people involved public shaming, highlighting their transgression to their peers and elders, or corporal punishment frequently administered not necessarily by state officials, but by family elders or leaders within their Kalpuli unit. It certainly wasn't an era or society that was particularly friendly to teenage rebellion or youthful experimentation. You pause for a moment remembering your own youth, perhaps times when you were a bit reckless testing boundaries, and you can't help but offer a silent, heartfelt thank you that you weren't navigating those awkward years under the watchful, potentially punitive eyes of officials in Tenochtitlan. As you walk past groups of people in what seemed to be the residential areas of Tenochtitlan, the walled compounds, the open communal courtyards where families lived in proximity, the workshops where artisans worked together, you see families going about their daily lives. Elders are chatting, younger women are weaving vibrant textiles on backstrap looms. Men are carving wood or obsidian, and children are playing traditional games with stones or small balls in sun-dappled courtyards. The vibrant everyday life of the city is happening all around you, and it feels safe and rooted because it is underpinned by this dense network of relationships, communal responsibility, and a very strict, widely understood and actively enforced code of conduct. You see young unmarried couples walking together if they are permitted to be together at all before official engagement, typically always accompanied by a chaperone, always maintaining a respectful, physically distant decorum. You see vendors interacting, customers engaging in polite, though perhaps sometimes spirited haggling, all within clear if unspoken boundaries of expected behavior and decorum. It becomes profoundly clear that this was a society where your personal life, and perhaps especially your intimate relationships, sexual behavior, and family conduct, were not treated as purely private matters to be handled behind closed doors. They were very much considered matters of public interest, deeply tied to community harmony, family honor, and ultimately subject to legal control and sanction. This understanding makes you appreciate the relative anonymity, privacy, and sheer freedom of modern life all the more acutely. Even the simple freedom to make potentially awkward romantic or relational choices without any fear whatsoever of direct, potentially fatal state intervention. You find yourself idly hoping that you aren't somehow accidentally committing some incredibly obscure yet legally significant social faux pas simply by trying to purchase, say, a refreshing tamarind fruit from a street vendor or admiring some artwork. Better to move on. Hopefully we can journey next to a historical place where the legal code around relationships was a little less comprehensive and terrifying. One can always hope, right? Okay, so you've managed to absorb the fundamental, gripping realities of the Aztec legal landscape. You've grasped the intensity of the social hierarchy and how it shaped everything. The pervasive sense of vigilance required to avoid punishment. The terrifying speed and finality of justice, even for actions that seem trivial by today's standards. You've internalized how absolutely brutal the consequences were for major crimes that struck at the heart of the empire's stability. And now you've also understood the deep, often astonishingly severe ways that Aztec law reached into personal conduct, specifically dictating how you were allowed to behave within relationships, who you could engage with sexually, and carrying extreme penalties for transgressing their deeply held norms around marriage, sex, and family. It honestly feels a bit intrusive, like the government has somehow morphed into your most judgmental, overbearing, distant relative, except instead of just nagging you about why you're still single, they might potentially execute you for certain choices in your private life. As we just touched upon, adultery, remember, wasn't simply frowned upon or something that led to a messy separation. It was unequivocally considered a capital crime. Imagine going on a terrible date that went south, and the ultimate punishment for one mistake is, well, permanently not dating anyone ever again under any circumstances. Both the man and the woman involved, if caught and found guilty, faced the harshest penalty the state could deliver. The methods, as mentioned, were grimly final, often death by public stoning or strangulation. This was very deliberately not a quiet private matter handled discreetly. These executions were typically carried out in public places in full view of the community, serving as a stark, visual, unforgettable warning to everyone about the ultimate cost of straying from their marital vows. The severity of this punishment can't be overstated. It profoundly underscores how fundamental, how absolutely essential the stability of marriage and the family unit was considered to the overall health, harmony, and functioning of the Aztec state itself. It wasn't only about abstract morality in their eyes. It was intrinsically linked to maintaining the very foundation and social fabric of their organized society. Suddenly, the dating pool you might imagine navigating here shrinks to a tiny, closely scrutinized puddle, and the absolute stakes for any misstep shoot through the already high roof. Incest similarly was treated as an absolute unconscionable taboo, also punishable universally by death. The legal and social definition of incest within the Aztec framework was quite broad, intended to cover relationships not just between immediate nuclear family members, parent and child, brother and sister, but also relationships between more distant relatives extending outwards within the recognized kinship structures. This deep-seated taboo seems to resonate across many diverse human cultures throughout recorded history, and the Aztecs enforced their version with unyielding lethal seriousness. There were effectively no acceptable exceptions cited, no perceived mitigating circumstances that would excuse such a transgression. If you were caught, found guilty, and it fell under their definition, that was effectively the absolute end of your story within their world. For young people in Aztec society, especially teenagers and young adults before marriage, the rules governing their behavior and interactions, particularly between the sexes, were incredibly, perhaps oppressively strict. Premarital chastity was highly valued, emphasized as essential, and fiercely guarded with a particularly intense focus on the conduct and purity of young women. You weren't just allowed to stumble your way through adolescence and young adulthood on your own, making your own choices, and hopefully learning from your mistakes in relative privacy. Absolutely not. Instead, there was a constant, ubiquitous, incredibly watchful eye from elders, immediate family members, and appointed community officials, essentially everyone who had a stake in upholding the Kalpuli's honor and maintaining societal order. Young people of the noble class attended the Kalmakak elite schools that focused on religious training, history, astrology writing, and leadership and moral discipline. Commoner youth attended the Telpachkali institutions focused on military training, history, civics, and practical skills, and crucially, instruction in expected moral conduct, community duties, and strict adherence to societal norms. Any deviation from the highly prescribed expected behavior, any sign of inappropriate interaction, was quickly noticed and could readily lead to formal inquiry and potentially swift punishment. Often punishments for youthful transgressions involved public shaming intended to highlight the individual's failure to live up to expectations and to shame their family within the community. Corporal punishment was also used, frequently administered, again, not necessarily by uniformed state police, but by respected family elders, or the leaders of their Kalpuli group. It feels almost stiflingly regulated compared to modern teenage life. Imagine being a teenager attempting to navigate adolescence and burgeoning social feelings in this environment. Forget about sneaking out late at night. Forget about posting questionable or provocative photos on social media platforms, obviously. You couldn't even really engage in seemingly innocent actions like simply holding hands with someone you were interested in, or spending unchaperoned time together in public without risking significant trouble. Your entire social and emotional life, especially if it involved potential romantic interests, was heavily chaperoned, intensely scrutinized, and governed by a strict code of conduct that would probably make even the most buttoned-up Victorian parent blush deep scarlet in astonishment at its intensity. One fascinating tidbit, which might veer towards the fringe in its specific enforcement, but highlights the general anxiety around young people's conduct, suggests that even relatively innocent interactions between young, unmarried men and women, something as seemingly harmless as walking together alone outside the view of elders, or spending time talking together unchaperoned in a slightly secluded spot, could potentially be noticed, reported to family or community elders, and lead to formal investigations or minor punishments, like sharp public reprimands directed at the individuals and their families. It wasn't quite guilty until proven innocent across the board, but it definitely leaned heavily towards a framework where if your behavior looked suspiciously like you might be deviating from expected norms, you were likely going to be deemed guilty of something that required correction or intervention. Marriage itself in the Aztec context, as mentioned earlier, was a highly formal and often incredibly complex legal and social process. It was much more than just a personal choice between two individuals deciding to spend their lives together. It deeply involved often lengthy and detailed negotiations between the respective families of the potential bride and groom. Once agreed upon, it culminated in specific public ceremonies and rituals, and upon completion, the marriage was fully recognized legally and socially by the community and the state. While as mentioned, divorce was a possibility recognized under specific legal grounds, it wasn't something entered into lightly or casually exited. As noted, grounds included things like cruelty by one spouse, persistent neglect of familial duties, or recognized inability to have children. But obtaining a divorce required going through a formal legal process, typically involving presenting your case to a panel of community elders or designated local judges who would carefully consider the evidence and decide whether to grant the dissolution of the marriage contract. And violating the ongoing responsibilities of marriage, particularly the unjustifiable abandonment of your spouse, or even worse, your children, was treated very seriously by the state and community. Such abandonment could lead to significant penalties, including sentences of forced labor for the community, or even as a reflection of breaking the fundamental social contract inherent in the family unit, a period of, or sometimes permanent, enslavement. You look back at the complexities and challenges people face in modern relationships, the relatively straightforward process in many places of divorce, and you fully realize that the modern concept of a simple conscious uncoupling or amicable separation was definitively not an option available here. Instead, it was more akin to navigating a potentially difficult, legally sanctioned and societally overseen restructuring of a core unit. From a mainstream historical fact perspective, there were specific recognized courts or councils responsible for handling matters related to family law, marriage, and divorce. These were often panels of experienced elders within the Kalpuli structure, or officially designated judges, specializing in domestic matters. So it wasn't just informal mediation where people talked things out without consequence. There was a structured legal process for resolving disputes within families and dissolving marital contracts when grounds were deemed sufficient. However, this process also included the very real potential for significant social hurdles, judgment from the community, and of course direct legal penalties if the rules of marriage or dissolution were violated. Ultimately, the punishments the Aztecs meted out for violating these specific social and sexual norms weren't solely about the act itself in isolation. They were very deeply about the disruption that such acts caused to the meticulously maintained social order, about the public dishonor and shame that could be brought upon not just the individual, but their entire family name and their Kalpuli, and about upholding the core values the society deemed essential for its stability and prosperity. For individuals of noble birth, the expectations and rules around their conduct, especially in these areas, were often perceived as even stricter, as they were expected to provide a moral example and uphold the highest standards of dignity and behavior for all of society. A noble involved in a sexual scandal, for instance, could face not just personal punishment from the legal system or spiritual consequences, but also a potentially devastating permanent loss of their highly valued prestige, the confiscation of their property, and severe damage to their family's established standing and influence within the noble class and the empire. Historians continue to explore and debate whether the strict written laws regarding sexual and personal conduct were genuinely enforced with absolute equality across all social classes, or if in reality wealthy or powerful nobles were sometimes able to leverage their influence connections or potentially resort to means like bribery to mitigate or lessen the severe punishments they might face compared to commoners for similar transgressions. Despite what the codified laws stated explicitly, walking now through what you perceive as the residential areas of Tenochtitlan, sensing the structures of family and community, you see the high, sometimes walled compounds, the glimpses of shared communal courtyards, where daily life unfolded, the overall palpable sense of incredibly close-knit communities where lives were lived in proximity. You see families clearly working together, perhaps groups of women weaving side by side, men carving or crafting tools in communal areas, children playing within safe confines. This profoundly strong, interconnected community structure is undoubtedly one significant reason why personal behavior, even within what might feel like a private family unit, was nonetheless subject to such constant, keen scrutiny from beyond your immediate household. Everyone's actions, particularly the notable missteps, reflected not just on themselves or their immediate parents, but on their entire extended kinship group and their specific Kalpuli district. You find yourself feeling a persistent sense of being constantly observed, perhaps not by official paid government spies, though that likely existed too, but by neighbors, by respected elders, by everyone within your orbit, who had a very real stake in maintaining the community's good reputation, its internal order, and its overall standing within the larger city structure. It profoundly makes you think twice, perhaps multiple times, before doing anything even remotely questionable like trying to approach and pet a stray dog wandering nearby. Wade is approaching strange animals illegal here too. You probably don't want to risk finding out. While the attention often gravitates understandable towards the incredibly harsh capital crimes and their terrifying punishments, it is crucial to remember that lesser violations of these pervasive social norms, such as inappropriate or overt public displays of affection, showing perceived disrespect towards community elders or lineage leaders, or general actions that were considered a breach of community decorum, but didn't reach the level of capital offenses, could still lead to various forms of public shaming, or localized corporal punishment administered within the community structure. The underlying goal in most instances for lesser and greater offenses alike was always intended to powerfully reinforce the expected societal behavior, maintain social harmony, and uphold the complex web of respect and hierarchy. Even if the specific methods used to achieve this seem extraordinarily harsh, controlling, or invasive to a modern set of eyes and values. This was without question a society that didn't limit its legal system purely to punishing serious criminals after major acts had been committed. It actively policed morality, public behavior, and even deeply personal conduct in ways that feel almost impossibly intrusive and encompassing now. You breathe a quiet, perhaps slightly shaky sigh of profound relief, knowing that your most embarrassing social moments, awkward romantic fumbles, minor public speaking stumbles, regrettable things said after a drink or two, are likely at worst just digitally archived on someone's phone screen somewhere in the world, rather than being matters brought before public legal proceedings with potential and irreversible fatal outcomes sanctioned by the state. Time to try and ease ourselves gently out of the intensely regulated high-stakes legal landscape of the Aztec world, perhaps seeking a slightly different, hopefully slightly less terrifying set of rules governing life in another ancient civilization. One can truly profoundly hope, right? You take a deep, perhaps slightly shaky breath, feeling that almost constant low-level sense of being under pervasive observation and the weight of potential consequences slowly beginning to recede as the incredibly vibrant, complex, but also undeniably terrifying cityscape of Tenochtitlan gradually starts to soften around the edges and eventually melts away behind you. The air changes around you. It shifts profoundly. The lake humidity and the scent of copal incense and cooking fires dissipate, replaced by a dry, hot, palpable heat that carries the distinct smell of baked sand, sun-warmed mud bricks, and something perhaps slightly mineral-like. The sensation under your feet changes dramatically. The smooth, hard volcanic causeway stone is gone, giving way to soft, warm earth that squishes slightly with each step you take. You open your eyes now to see a different kind of landscape entirely. Instead of a lake city, you see the endless, shimmering, almost impossibly wide blue of a truly mighty river, stretching out before you, flanked on either side by narrow, incredibly intensely green strips of vibrant cultivation fed and nourished by the life-giving water. And beyond those fertile green bands lies the vast, seemingly infinite, often terrifying sun-baked landscape of the unforgiving desert, stretching away towards the horizon in every direction. In the hazy distance, rising majestically from the flat plain under an unbelievably bright, almost searing blue sky, you see colossal stone structures, towering pyramids, grand temples, massive gateways. These are not built of rough volcanic rock, but of dressed stone, lighter in color, shimmering in the heat. Welcome, you realize, to ancient Egypt, where the rules of society and the nature of justice were different from the Aztec world you just left behind, certainly distinct. But sometimes the consequences and punishments were nonetheless just as creatively and painfully awful, though often directed towards slightly different aspects of life and order. Ancient Egypt, over its thousands of years of history, wasn't organized or centralized in quite the same incredibly fierce, strictly hierarchical social pyramid way as the Aztec Empire, focused intently on lineage and military tribute. However, the concept of order, known as Ma'at, was absolutely paramount to the Egyptian worldview and their societal structure. Ma'at embodied profound interwoven concepts: truth, justice, harmony, cosmic balance, reciprocity, order. It wasn't just an abstract philosophical idea, it was seen as the fundamental force that kept the universe and human society from descending into utter chaos, which the Egyptians called Isfet. The pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, was not necessarily viewed as a living god on earth in quite the same direct way that Tlatoani was in Aztec thought. But the pharaoh was unequivocally considered the divine representative on earth, whose absolute primary duty was to uphold and embody Ma'at in all things. The laws and the legal system, therefore, were fundamentally seen as direct extensions of this sacred duty of the pharaoh, and the divine imperative to maintain order and balance in both the human realm and the cosmos. It wasn't merely about controlling the behavior of people. It was deeply about ensuring that the world, both seen and unseen, functioned precisely as it should, constantly keeping that disruptive, dangerous chaos firmly at bay. This foundational philosophy perhaps makes you feel slightly less panicked initially than the rigid Aztec focus on blood and place. Maybe this profound cultural emphasis on harmony and cosmic balance means things were generally more lenient or gentle for everyday folk. A quick reality check whispers back. Spoiler alert. Historical punishments across cultures rarely fall into the gentle category for serious matters, not always the case. The Egyptian legal system evolved over millennia, and while it might not have produced the vast enduring written law codes, is famously documented in other Near Eastern societies like Hammurabi's Babylon centuries later. We nonetheless know a great deal about how justice was typically administered from the wealth of surviving historical records, including actual court transcripts preserved on papyrus. Documents the detailed inscriptions left in tombs by officials, and accounts from foreign visitors. They had courts at various levels. Commoners could bring grievances, complaints, or disputes before local councils, often made up of respected village elders or local officials. Councils sometimes known as the Kenbet. More serious or complex cases, or those involving higher status individuals or transcending local boundaries, were escalated to higher regional or even state-level courts presided over by professional judges and administrators. There was a structure, processes, and a degree of official oversight reflecting a functional bureaucratic society. Now, let's get right to some of the punishments where the different cultural priorities become starkly evident compared to the Aztecs. Unlike the intense Aztec emphasis on publicly policing moral and sexual conduct, particularly for minor personal failings like mild public drunkenness or minor gossip, Egyptian punishments seem to have been heavily viscerally focused on clear deterrence, making a frightening example. Direct retribution, making the punishment very directly and often physically fit the crime in a highly literal and sometimes horrifying sense, and robustly maintaining the specific concepts of Ma'at order. Property rights, truthfulness in official contexts like courts, and respect for the divine order. Theft in particular appears to have been a persistent problem and was considered a major offense, especially large-scale theft, organized banditry, or perhaps most heinously the robbery of tombs or temple treasures. Such acts, which fundamentally undermined property ownership and deeply violated sacred spaces or the rest of the revered dead, were frequently met with extremely severe, undeniable consequences. This brings us to a well-documented mainstream historical fact about ancient Egyptian justice. Mutilation was a tragically common and widely applied form of punishment for certain serious offenses, most notably for persistent theft and for perjury lying under oath in legal proceedings. The principle seems straightforward, embodying that direct retribution idea. If you were caught stealing, particularly engaging in large-scale larceny from significant public stores like grain silos or temple granaries, or especially caught in the sacrilegious and deeply feared act of robbing a tomb, the consequence could very well be the loss of the offending body part. The hand that stole would be cut off. A shockingly direct link between crime and physical consequence. Similarly, if you were found guilty of intentionally lying under oath in court, particularly if your false testimony resulted in another innocent person being wrongly punished, or if you fabricated documents to defraud, you might lose the offending organs of deceit, perhaps your tongue, or you might have your nose and ears cut off. This latter punishment was also sometimes applied to repeat thieves, or those who escaped capture after previous crimes. Imagine trying to explain the absence of your nose and ears, or why you couldn't speak clearly at, say, a large village gathering. Oh, this, yes. Well, I told a slight fib during neighbor Theban's court case about borrowing his prized donkey. Live and learn, I suppose. Losing a hand, while survivable, would obviously make performing basic daily tasks, like carrying water jars, working fields, or crafting objects incredibly difficult, and your ability to earn a living severely hampered. Losing your nose would profoundly change your appreciation for the smells of daily life, the aromas of baking bread or street food, let alone perfumes and incense. And losing your tongue, Well beyond the obvious pain and inability to speak normally, it rather puts a definitive end to any future plans of giving eloquent courtroom testimony, or for that matter, engaging in malicious gossip. Historians continue to explore and debate the exact frequency and specific application of these brutal mutilation punishments. Were they truly applied routinely as the standard penalty for all instances of theft or perjury regardless of scale? Or were they primarily reserved for cases involving large amounts of stolen goods, repeat offenders who had been warned before, or particularly heinous acts like temple or tomb robbery and lies that cause severe demonstrable harm? While the records document the existence of these punishments clearly, the extent to which they were the default outcome versus reserved for more serious cases, or whether lower courts might use lesser penalties before resorting to mutilation, is still a subject of scholarly discussion. But the potential reality of such punishments certainly existed and loomed large for certain offenders. Here's a particularly quirky and arguably fringe tidbit that has fascinated and perplexed historians, stemming primarily from the accounts of ancient Greek travelers like Herodotus, who visited Egypt and wrote about what he observed or heard. Herodotus famously wrote about a rather specific and utterly bizarre punishment, said to be meted out to women caught in adultery in certain parts of Egypt, during his era, which was much later than the height of some of the periods we're discussing during the late period or Persian rule. He claimed that such women were first paraded naked through the streets, a form of public shaming. And if they were found guilty, he astonishingly claimed they were thrown to crocodiles. Now, it's crucial to state that modern Egyptologists intensely debate the historical accuracy and widespread reality of this specific account. It might well have been an exaggeration on Herodotus's part, a misinterpretation of a different custom, something limited to a tiny geographic area, or a specific isolated time period, or even a conflation with some mythological or cautionary tale, rather than a standard legal practice. But the image it conjures is undeniably striking and horrifying, isn't it? Imagine that potential courtroom summation. Given the evidence, the jury finds the defendant lunch for the local reptile population. Most evidence from native Egyptian sources points to adultery being punished through means like severe beatings, mandatory divorce initiated by either spouse, or financial penalties, such as compensating the wronged party with property, rather than usually resulting in a fatal dip with Nile predators. But Herodotus insisted he heard this was practiced. It serves as a potent reminder that ancient sources, while invaluable, sometimes contain details that strain modern credulity and require careful scrutiny and comparison with other evidence. Other documented punishments in ancient Egypt included forced labor, often in extremely harsh and dangerous conditions, particularly in the unforgiving gold mines or stone quarries located deep in the scorching desert or remote regions. Condemnation to the mines *, or other terms, was often effectively a death sentence in itself, due to the grueling physical toil, intense heat, poor food, lack of water, and constant danger of collapse or accident. Beatings were also very common and frequently applied. Punishments could range from a relatively light few strokes of the cane or rod for minor infractions or administrative failures to severe floggings, numbering in the dozens or even hundreds of strokes for more serious crimes or acts of insubordination. For very serious offenses against the state or religious order like high treason against the pharaoh, or perhaps particularly egregious repeat offenses of tomb robbing, which again was seen almost as a form of treason or cosmic disruption against the deceased king, and the state's veneration of its ruler's execution was a potential ultimate possibility, though perhaps used somewhat less frequently as a standard penalty compared to comprehensive mutilation or condemnation to death by labor in the mines, when compared to the frequent use of capital punishment for many crimes in societies like the Aztecs. Corrupt officials, scribes, and administrators also faced potentially very harsh penalties if their malfeasance was discovered. Their dishonesty and abuse of power were seen as undermining the very foundation of Ma'at, disrupting the proper ordered flow of resources, distorting truth, and denying just treatment to the people. A scribe found guilty of falsifying records to defraud, or an official caught extorting villagers, could face severe physical beatings, mutilation as with perjury, or steep demotion, and a lifetime sentence of hard labor in the mines or quarries. While an official's status often afforded them privilege and a layer of protection, or perhaps allowed their cases to be handled differently, often in special courts, or by higher officials, it did not guarantee absolute immunity if they were caught egregiously abusing their significant power and disrupting Ma'at. You walk along the edge of the Nile now, the vast river stretching out, the sun beating down on your head, making the air seem to shimmer in the heat. You see the cyclical rhythm of life here. Farmers tending the narrow bands of intensely green fields along the riverbanks, fishermen on the river itself casting nets. Scribes seated nearby, keeping careful records on papyrus scrolls under shaded awnings. Soldiers standing guard with spears. Life feels perhaps generally calmer and less intensely perpetually rigid in its social policing compared to the suffocating order of Tenochtitlan, at least from your perspective as an observer. But you are now acutely aware that despite the focus on harmony and balance, serious consequences loom here too. Disrespecting a temple area, taking something that doesn't belong to you, especially if it's valuable or sacred, or even simply failing to tell the absolute truth under oath in court, could easily lead to a permanent visible loss of a crucial body part. You instinctively and nervously check that your hands are plainly visible as you pass through a busy area, and decide very quickly that admiring that small, shiny scarab beetle amulet for sale in the marketplace is best done from a significant cautious distance, without even the hint of a reaching motion. You also make a strong mental note to carefully consider your words and absolute truthfulness should you interact with anyone official, and certainly not to gossip about the pharaoh's perhaps unconventional new headdress, just in case criticizing leadership's fashion choices carries a disproportionate legal risk. Compared to the Aztec legal system's pervasive focus on public moral policing, intensely regulating everything down to personal appearance, drunkenness, and private sexual conduct through a framework deeply tied to community and lineage honor, the ancient Egyptians, based on surviving evidence, appear to have focused their most brutal physical punishments, more specifically on protecting tangible property theft, tomb robbing, maintaining the integrity of their core formal systems, truth in courts for perjury, honest officials, and respecting the divine and royal order. It's a different kind of fear that hangs in the air, perhaps less about constant moral judgment from your neighbor, and more about simply putting your hands or your mouth where they unequivocally do not belong, quite literally and legally. Time perhaps to let the golden light of the Egyptian sun fade slightly, and float ourselves down the metaphorical river of time and space, a bit further, seeing what other ancient cultures had waiting in store for those who chose or were accused of choosing to break their particular sets of rules. This historical journey, it seems, is frequently getting quite pointed, leaving the dry heat, the shimmering light, and the potential pointy consequences of ancient Egypt behind you. Feel another distinct shift in the air and the environment around you. The wide, flat desert vistas and the endless blue sweep of the Nile recede. The damp chill of medieval sewage is not present either. Instead, the landscape gradually changes to one of rolling green hills, organized vineyards stretching across the slopes in neat rows, and eventually the unmistakable appearance of durable, remarkably straight paved roads. Built not just for easy walking, but clearly designed for the efficient movement of people, goods, and legions over vast distances. These roads lead you towards a city on a human scale certainly larger than many medieval towns, but perhaps not with the mind-boggling built on a lake spectacle of Tenochtitlan. Yet this city, even from its outskirts, exudes a sense of monumental scale, ambition, and power on a different level entirely. You are standing now on the periphery of Rome, the heart of a vast and influential empire that prided itself perhaps above many things on order, law, and practicality, albeit filtered through a deeply ingrained sense of hierarchy and the inherent rights and lack thereof based on your social station. The sounds here are different from the murmur of Nahuatl or the rhythms of life on the Nile. You hear the steady, organized clang of hammers from blacksmiths, the more distant, muffled roar of a massive crowd emanating from structures of public entertainment like the Colosseum, and the ceaseless flowing murmur of conversation in Latin, a language whose influence, like the empire's legal traditions, would resonate for centuries to come. The Roman legal system, which evolved over centuries from its early foundations like the Law of the 12 Tables, to the vast body of statutes, decrees, and sophisticated interpretations of learned jurists in its later imperial period, is globally famous for its complexity, its depth, and its enduring influence. Roman law forms the explicit basis for many legal traditions and civil law systems still used throughout the world today. It was incredibly detailed, attempting to provide comprehensive regulations for vast areas of life, from contracts and property to crime and family matters. Rome had a complex system of courts for different types of cases. Minor disputes might be heard by city magistrates, more complex civil matters handled by specialized judges, judices, and serious criminal trials involving citizens potentially brought before assemblies of the people, or in the imperial era presided over by the emperor or his designated prefects. There were established procedures, rules of evidence of a sort, and systems of pleading. But even with all this legal sophistication, this structure and apparent rationality, the Romans nonetheless maintained and sometimes created some truly profoundly odd, specific, and often gruesome punishments within their broad range of sanctions, proving that inventiveness in consequences wasn't limited to other cultures. And notably, starkly similar to the Aztecs' Roman society, was highly stratified. Your social status was perhaps the single greatest determinant of your treatment under the law, not just in how your case was handled, but especially in the type and severity of punishment you would face if found guilty. Whether you were a full Roman citizen with further layers of status even within citizenship like plebeian versus patrician, though those lines blurred over time, a non-citizen free person living in the empire. A peregrinus a former slave who had been legally freed. Freedman or freedwoman or fundamentally still a slave, service . This status dictated your fundamental rights and your vulnerability before the legal system. A crime that might result in a manageable fine, a period of exile from the city, or perhaps temporary loss of privileges for a wealthy, well-connected citizen, could for the exact same offense mean agonizing execution, horrific mutilation, or a lifetime of soul-crushing forced labor in the mines for a slave, a lower-class free person, or sometimes even a recently freed individual. The concept of true equality before the law as an ideal, that was most definitely not one of Rome's widely practiced strong suits throughout most of its history. Now let's get to some of those truly peculiar Roman punishments, the ones that make you scratch your head in their sheer focused inventiveness. The Romans had a certain dark genius for making the punishment powerfully symbolize the nature of the crime, often in ways that were both incredibly specific, intensely painful, and yes, quite frankly theatrical in their cruelty. This brings us to perhaps one of the most infamous and bizarre specific Roman punishments documented, poena culle often translated literally as the punishment of the sack. This incredibly specific ritualistic punishment was uniquely reserved initially and primarily for the crime of patricide, the act of killing one's own father. Later, it was sometimes extended to cover the murder of other, very close male relatives who stood in a paternal relationship, like a grandfather, or perhaps an uncle. This wasn't just a standard, relatively quick form of execution like beheading or hanging used for general murder. Oh no. The process of poena culle was meticulously horrifying and deeply symbolic. The convicted person was first formally scourged, brutally whipped as part of the initial ritual. Then. While still alive, they were sewn into a large leather sack, but the sack was not empty. Enclosed within that same sack with the condemned person was a truly bizarre and specific menagerie of live animals, traditionally. This included a dog, a rooster, a monkey, and a snake. And finally with the person. And this struggling collection of animals enclosed together, the sack was typically thrown into a river, the sea, or sometimes a body of water like a large public pool. The profound symbolism underlying this grotesque practice was undeniably clear and meant to inspire absolute horror. The crime of patricide, killing the man who was literally your source of life and head of the household, the paterfamilias who held immense legal power, was seen as so utterly unnatural, so profoundly monstrous, and a violation of the foundational structure of Roman society, the family, and the very order of nature itself, that the perpetrator was deemed unfit to die a normal death, or even be contained by human or natural means alone. By being sewn into a sack with animals from different natural realms, dog, bird, primate, reptile, and cast into the water, the individual was being deliberately and ritually expelled from the company of men, expelled from society, and even cast out of the natural order of things, left to die. A horrific, claustrophobic, agonizing death, struggling in confinement with scared, dangerous creatures before drowning or suffocating. It's almost hard to conceive of the thought process behind its invention and application. Imagine presenting that particular penalty concept to a modern-day focus group or a legislative committee tasked with reviewing sentencing guidelines. So for this particular heinous crime, we're thinking, well, a large sack. Yes. And then, fill it with several kinds of small, living, possibly panicked animals, precisely for traditionally. And then, well, yes, throw the whole thing, occupant and creatures, into a large body of water. It really sends a message, gets the symbolism across. Any thoughts? It was an incredibly specific, viscerally gruesome punishment reserved for a crime perceived as uniquely offensive and unnatural within the Roman world. Historians continue to debate various aspects of poena culle Was it truly an ancient Etruscan custom that the Romans adopted given its peculiar non-Roman feel? Was it applied consistently throughout the long sweep of Roman history? Or did it fall in and out of favor over centuries? Did the specific asterisk types asterisk of animals included in the sack genuinely vary over time or depending on the region within the empire? Or are such variations simply anecdotal differences recorded by various ancient writers? The existence of the practice is clear from multiple Roman legal sources, but the exact frequency and uniform details of its application remain a fascinating subject of scholarly debate around this uniquely awful punishment. The Romans also had a distinct fondness for integrating public spectacle and punishment, especially execution, into their cultural and entertainment life. Executions of serious criminals were often carried out in highly visible public places, frequently within the massive amphitheaters and arenas that define their cities, sometimes specifically integrated into gladiatorial games or other large-scale public entertainment events as part of the day's grisly program. Death for a convicted person could come via crucifixion, a particularly slow, excruciatingly painful method frequently used for non-citizens, rebels, and slaves being thrown to specially selected wild beasts like lions or bears in the arena floor. Asterisk damnatio, ad bestias asterisk, often without means to defend oneself or being burned alive, among other methods. These public deaths were intended to be more than just efficient ways to end a life. They were explicit, undeniable displays of Roman state power, visual demonstrations of the inevitable consequences for challenging that authority or fundamentally violating their laws. They were intended to entertain a reflection of the era's values, unsettling as that is, and fundamentally to deeply terrify potential criminals in the assembled crowds. You find yourself experiencing a wave of profound relief that your personal entertainment options tonight are probably limited to benign streaming services or reading a book, definitely not involving attending or witnessing public executions designed as mass entertainment. For lesser crimes than those demanding the asterisk poenacule asterisk or execution, various forms of corporal punishment were common and also often administered publicly. Beatings asterisk verberatio asterisk or intense scourging, more severe flogging, were frequently used, often carried out in the town square or a designated public space. Fines were also levied for a range of offenses, though the amount demanded would of course vary wildly, depending on your social class and wealth. Exile asterisk exilium asterisk was another significant punishment, particularly utilized for citizens of status found guilty of serious crimes that perhaps did not technically warrant the ultimate death penalty, but were serious enough that their presence in the city or the empire was deemed undesirable. Being formally banished from Rome and its territories meant not only a potentially permanent physical separation from your home friends and social network, but also the likely and significant loss of your property, your social standing, and your connection to the very heart and privilege of Roman citizenship, a particularly severe penalty in a society that placed such extraordinary value on the status and belonging that came with being a Roman citizen. Here's another potentially quirky, or maybe even fringe tidbit of Roman law or practice that appears in some historical accounts relating to punishments specifically aimed at property damage or certain seemingly unusual types of theft or trespass. There are accounts within the complex body of Roman legal texts and historical writings that appear to describe specific, almost performative punishments prescribed for certain agricultural offenses or crimes against the produce of the land. For instance, some interpretations or specific ancient accounts suggest that someone definitively caught stealing crops, particularly if done under the cover of darkness asterisk, furtum nocturnum asterisk of crops, might be sentenced not just to physical punishment or fines, but perhaps in older traditions, or for particularly symbolic crimes against agricultural production, might actually be ritualistically sacrificed to the goddess Ceres, who was the Roman deity of agriculture, grain, and fertility. While the historicity of this as a asterisk widespread, routinely applied asterisk legal punishment by Roman civil courts, as opposed to being a remnant of older, perhaps rural, religious practices, or simply a striking historical anecdote recorded by writers to illustrate ancient severity, is actively debated among scholars of Roman law. The mere idea that a crime against asterisk property asterisk, specifically the yield of the earth, upon which society depended, could theoretically lead to a direct, ritualistic sacrifice intended to appease the divine is undeniably unique, bizarre, and a powerful illustration of how deeply integrated concepts of religion, divine favor, and even the law regarding physical property could be woven together in the ancient world. It suggested that offending a man by taking his crops might also simultaneously and just as seriously mean offending the relevant goddess Ceres herself. One final noteworthy form of Roman punishment that sounds simply like forced labor, but was used as a specific legal sentence was being formally condemned to the mines damnatio ad metallo or to quarries. While it undeniably was just backbreaking forced labor performed in incredibly harsh conditions, dangerous, hot, unhealthy environments with brutal overseers. It was nonetheless a distinct legal sentence used for serious crimes, often applied primarily to the lower classes. Non-citizens and slaves, wealthier citizens, might be exiled instead for similar crimes. A sentence of damnatio ad metallo was in grim reality, often functionally equivalent to a death sentence, just one that occurred slowly, grueling day underground, or chipping away rock face, rather than through immediate execution. But it was formalized as a specific legal pronouncement, like a judge declaring, "You are hereby sentenced not to immediate death, but to death via slow, brutal labor performed in a dark, dangerous hole, far from civilization, likely cutting your remaining lifespan drastically and involving unimaginable suffering." Walking through the impressive remnants of the Roman Forum, even just in your mind's eye, you see the vast, imposing architecture columns still standing centuries later, the sense of solid engineering and power. You hear or imagine hearing the echoes of debates perhaps held centuries ago in the Senate House. You observe the precise formations of soldiers marching by the bedrock of Roman military might, maintaining that order. The order, the tangible power, the sheer scale and enduring ambition of Rome as a civilization and an empire is undeniably awe-inspiring. But even amidst this sense of structure and sophistication, you also grasp and sense the darker, often brutal undercurrent. You might mentally picture stocks or pillories that likely stood in public squares for lesser punishments. The haunted, desperate look that historical accounts sometimes describe in the eyes of enslaved people whose lives were subject entirely to their master's whim and the state's authority. The ever-present knowledge that behind the grand facade of codified law lay a system of justice that could be incredibly creatively and specifically cruel especially if you weren't lucky enough to possess the immensely valuable shield and status of being a Roman citizen. You very quickly and instinctively decide to be extra careful not to trip over a prominent cobblestone or accidentally bump into, or heaven forbid, seem to insult a statue of one of the emperors towering in the Forum. Better safe certainly than risk finding yourself sewn into a large leather sack with a dog, a rooster, a monkey, and a snake before being dumped into a river. Just definitely better safe. Let's hope that the ensuing era medieval Europe might perhaps have been a touch more conventional, a bit less focused on animal companionship as a form of terminal punishment. We shall see. Okay? Taking a moment to recover from the highly specific animal-inclusive potential consequences lurking within the otherwise structured and influential legal system of Rome, you physically feel a distinct environmental shift once more as the remnants of stone arches and paved roads recede. The air grows cooler, losing the dry heat of Egypt and the often searing intensity of Rome. The vast, ambitious architecture of empire gives way to less structured, perhaps more natural landscapes that soon feature muddy tracks winding through fields, the occasional cluster of buildings featuring simple thatched roofs, and structures built more primarily of timber. Castles, imposing stone fortifications often standing on hills or strategic points, begin to loom in the distance with increasing frequency, their very presence symbols of a political landscape characterized by fragmented power and localized authority, very different from the centralized empires we've just explored. And the scent here is undeniably different too. The familiar earthy smell of wood smoke from countless hearths and fires mixes with the scent of livestock in close proximity, and often regrettably something vaguely persistently unpleasant that clings to the air, a definite olfactory reminder of rudimentary sanitation. Let's just call it historic sewage for politeness' sake. You've arrived in medieval Europe, spanning a broad period often romanticized in tales of chivalrous knights imposing castles and royal courts. But for the vast majority of the common folk living during this era, especially for those accused, whether rightly or wrongly, of breaking the complex web of laws and customs, the reality was often incredibly grim, physically painful, and remarkably inventive in its various methods of punishment, often designed as much for public spectacle as for consequence. Justice in the Middle Ages, over its long, diverse span, and across its many kingdoms and regions, wasn't a single, cohesive, consistently applied, centralized, codified system like that established in Rome. Nor was it necessarily structured strictly around a pervasive social pyramid and religious state link like the Aztecs. Instead, it was typically a messy, overlapping, often confusing patchwork of authorities and courts. Power was deeply decentralized after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Justice could be dispensed in the local courts of feudal lords who held immense power over their tenants and lands. It could fall under the jurisdiction of evolving royal or king's courts, whose authority gradually grew over centuries, trying to establish a more unified legal tradition across a kingdom. It could be handled by church courts, or ecclesiastical courts, which held sway over members of the clergy, but also claimed jurisdiction over lay people for a wide range of matters deemed spiritual or moral. Things like marriage disputes, inheritance, especially involving wills, perjury because an oath was religious, and certain sexual offenses or accusations of heresy or witchcraft. And underneath or alongside these, a deep layer of diverse local customs and traditions often governed everyday disputes. This meant that who judged you, the specific laws applied to your case, and the punishment you might face could depend incredibly heavily and sometimes arbitrarily on simple geography, where you were when the crime occurred, which powerful feudal lord held sway over that land. Whether the church decided to get involved in your particular case due to the nature of the alleged offense, and even sometimes on the season of the year or the local political climate, the goals of punishment were varied, but often prominent among them were retribution. The offender must suffer clear deterrence, making very scary public example of someone to frighten everyone else into obedience, and frequently obtaining confessions, or extracting information sometimes under duress. Concepts of what we now understand as due process, such as the right to legal representation, protection against self-incrimination, or clear rules of evidence consistently applied, were, to put it mildly, largely optional, inconsistent, or simply non-existent in many medieval legal settings. Trials by ordeal, like holding hot iron or being thrown into water, or trial by combat where the outcome was left to perceived divine judgment, were also used particularly in earlier parts of the period. One undeniable, absolutely crucial aspect of medieval justice was its emphasis on public spectacle. It was theater, albeit grim theater. Executions, most forms of corporal punishment and penalties, specifically designed for shaming, were rarely, if ever, carried out behind closed doors or away from public view. They were performed in the most visible, prominent public places available, the bustling town square just outside the city gates, along a major road, or in a busy market area, intended for as many people as possible to witness. This was decidedly not about rehabilitation of the offender in a modern sense. It was a calculated, deliberate show of authority, a stark warning to the assembled populace, and often undeniably a form of public entertainment for a populace with limited recreational options. You walk past a sturdy-looking wooden structure standing on a small hill just outside the city walls. It has a crossbeam at the top. It looks suspiciously like a set of gallows. Your eyes dart away quickly. You definitely, absolutely do not want to be the star of that particular public production under any circumstances. This brings us to a key mainstream historical fact about medieval punishments, one of the most common forms of execution across large parts of medieval Europe for various felonies: hanging. It was widely used for crimes considered severe, such as murder, grand theft, larceny of a certain value, serious burglary, and sometimes rebellion or certain forms of outlawry. It was relatively simple to erect gallows and carry out, making it a frequent choice. However, for the crime considered most serious and personally offensive to the reigning monarch and the state, high treason, particularly in kingdoms like England, the punishment prescribed for men was often excruciatingly and famously the process known as hanging, drawing, and quartering. Now attempting to describe this while trying to keep within generally acceptable description guidelines and without being overly gruesome, the full penalty involved multiple stages designed to maximize suffering and dishonor. The condemned man was first dragged on a wooden frame hurdle to the place of execution. Then he was partially hanged by the neck but deliberately cut down while he was still alive and conscious. Following this, he was drawn, a term which could have various meanings depending on the time and place. It sometimes referred to the dragging itself, or more horrifyingly and commonly, it involved disemboweling him while still alive, his internal organs potentially burned before his eyes. And finally, he was quartered, meaning his body was cut or hacked into 4 distinct pieces, usually the 4 limbs. These separated body parts were then frequently taken to different prominent locations within the city or kingdom, such as displaying them on pikes outside city gates, as undeniable, terrifying, long-lasting visual deterrents to anyone contemplating disloyalty. It was a truly horrific multi-stage process, explicitly designed not just to kill, but to inflict maximum pain, humiliation, and disintegration of the physical body as a symbol of the destruction of their treasonous self and lineage. Imagine committing a crime so heinous in the eyes of the state that they couldn't be satisfied with just killing you once. They had to attempt to end your life repeatedly through agonizing means and then deliberately transform your dissected remains into morbid public art scattered for all to see. For women convicted of high treason in England during some periods, the punishment was typically prescribed as being burned at the stake, rather than hanged, drawn, and quartered. Again, aiming to keep this description focused on the method and its symbolic intent, rather than explicit gruesomeness, being burned alive, was also an agonizing method sometimes prescribed because it did not involve dismemberment of the female body, which was seen as more religiously significant, though historical reality of execution by burning was still horrific. It was also sometimes used for heresy and witchcraft in later periods, more on that in a moment, seen as a form of purification, or dealing with particularly insidious or polluting crimes. Regardless of the exact details of method depending on sex or precise era, the goal was extreme, public, visible, terrifying suffering and death for those who fundamentally threatened the established secular power structure at its highest level. For offenses considered less severe than treason or murder, but still warranting official punishment, medieval justice still had a definite flair for the physically uncomfortable and the publicly humiliating. Two incredibly common, indeed almost ubiquitous devices of medieval towns were the stocks and the pillory. These were standard go-to forms of public shaming and physical restraint and discomfort, used for a wide variety of often minor offenses or breaches of public order. If you were found guilty of being drunk and disorderly in public, using dishonest weights or measures when selling goods in the market, cheating someone in a business dealing, getting into a loud public brawl, or generally disturbing the peace with persistent disruptive behavior, you might well find yourself locked into one of these devices. The stocks typically consisted of heavy wooden frames with holes for the feet, and sometimes hands forcing you to sit. The pillory was usually an upright post, with a frame featuring holes for the head and hands, forcing you to stand bent over. In either case, you were firmly locked in place, completely exposed in the town square or market cross area for a set period. Sometimes just a few hours. Sometimes an entire day. Occasionally multiple days depending on the severity of the offense or the whim of the local magistrate. Passers-by, your neighbors, strangers. Everyone coming through the market could see you, mock you, shout insults at you, and famously often throw rotten food garbage, or worse, less polite refuse at you, compounding your misery and discomfort. This was much more than simply being uncomfortable or restrained. It was deeply and undeniably humiliating. It was intended to damage your reputation within the close-knit community, irrevocably making you a visible example of bad behavior and its consequences. You spot some sturdy, darkened wooden contraptions resembling the stocks near the center of the busy market area you are moving through, and you make a quiet, very serious mental note to measure your consumption of any local ale or mead tonight with extreme, uncharacteristic caution. Mutilation was also employed as a punishment in medieval Europe, though perhaps less uniformly or systematically codified across the entire continent or period, compared to its prominent use in ancient Egypt. For crimes involving deception, especially lying under oath and court perjury, seen as an offense against God, as well as man, or serious fraud, you might lose an ear. The offending part that heard or whispered lies might be physically removed in a public display. Repeat offenders for theft, particularly after several warnings and lesser punishments, might face the loss of a hand, the part that stole. Forgers might also have their hands removed or be branded. These punishments were not just intended to inflict significant, memorable physical pain at the time they were carried out. They resulted in permanent physical markers of your crime. Losing an ear, missing a hand, or having a brand burned onto your skin or forehead made it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to simply disappear into anonymity or live an entirely honest life afterward, as everyone who saw you would immediately recognize what you had done and what you had been punished for. Talk about a permanently physically visible criminal record that followed you everywhere. Now here is a truly unique, undeniably quirky, and definitely fringe tidbit from the medieval period that continues to baffle and fascinate scholars: animal trials. Yes, you absolutely read and heard that right. In various parts of medieval and early modern Europe, particularly under the jurisdiction of church courts, if an animal, say a domestic animal like a pig or a cow, or occasionally vermin like rats or insects, was deemed to have directly caused serious harm to a human being, such as killing a person, especially a child, or cause significant widespread property damage, like locusts destroying crops, that animal could be formally apprehended and actually put on trial in a court of law. The legal proceedings often followed the structure of human trials. The animal might have a lawyer formally appointed to defend it. Witnesses, human ones, naturally would be called to give sworn testimony about the animal's actions, and a formal verdict would be reached. If found guilty, the animal would then be sentenced and formally executed. The method of execution varied, but recorded instances include convicted animals being hanged on miniature gallows, or sometimes being burned. There are even documented cases of legal or religious bodies issuing formal excommunications against troublesome insects or vermin like slugs that were causing problems. It seems utterly, incredibly bizarre and perhaps comical to our modern legal minds, but it profoundly reflects a medieval worldview that was fundamentally different, where animals were sometimes perceived as capable of a form of moral agency, or at least were seen as part of the earthly realm subject to divine or human law, when they disrupted the order and caused harm to the divinely favored humanity. Or perhaps it served a psychological or social need, providing a structured legal process and a sense of satisfying justice and re-established order when a human victim had been harmed by a non-human perpetrator. Imagine the courtroom scene playing out with genuine solemnity for those involved. Your Honor, my client Porky Esquire vigorously maintains his innocence in the regrettable incident involving the mayor's child. We will prove it was clearly a case of complex self-defense motivated by fear. The witness account of the apple theft leading to the confrontation is simply not credible. Historians still debate how common or widespread animal trials actually were across all of Europe, or whether they were relatively rare occurrences that just happened to be notably well documented due to their unusual nature, and perhaps more importantly, what these peculiar trials truly reveal about deeply held medieval beliefs concerning animals, justice, moral responsibility, and the role of law in confronting the unsettling experience of suffering harm inflicted by creatures outside the typical human social and legal contract. Punishments were also rigorously varied, and often designed to fit the crime's specific nature and the perceived malicious intent behind it, especially for certain acts considered inherently destructive or morally offensive. Arson, deliberately setting fire to property, particularly if the fire endangered an entire town or caused widespread destruction, a very real and terrifying risk in medieval towns with many timber buildings packed closely together, was often punished with equivalent destructive finality. Frequently, the arsonist would be punished by being burned alive at the stake. Counterfeiting money, seen as a direct and fundamental attack against the sovereign's authority and the economic stability of the entire realm by devaluing coinage, was also considered a most serious offense against the state and could lead to agonizing death. Some historical accounts mention particularly cruel methods for coiners, including being boiled alive in water or oil, a method designed to inflict extreme suffering, sometimes decreed for such economically destabilizing crimes. And during periods of intense religious anxiety and formalized witch hunts, being accused and found guilty of witchcraft, which was increasingly categorized and prosecuted not just as a harmful act of magic, but often as a form of severe heresy, and a pact made directly with the devil, could also tragically and commonly result in being burned at the stake. Viewed legally and theologically both as a deserved punishment for the perceived pact with evil and as a form of cleansing fire intended in the grim logic of the time to purify the heretic's corrupted flesh. Walking through the crowded, often incredibly muddy, narrow streets of a medieval European town, perhaps Canterbury or Paris or Bruges, you hear the persistent cries of vendors peddling their goods, the rattling and clatter of wooden carts pulled over uneven surfaces, the frequent echoing sound of church bells marking the hours or calling the faithful to prayer. It feels incredibly chaotic, vibrant, intensely human, and teeming with life and activity. But simultaneously, there's a palpable underlying sense of potential danger, not just from disease or accident, but from the swiftness and harshness of the justice system, if you should fall afoul of it. The system seems perhaps less predictably uniform and codified than the complex layered Aztec or the bureaucratic Roman ones we discussed, seemingly more subject to the diverse and sometimes competing authorities of local feudal lords, with their own traditions, the extensive reach and unique laws of religious officials through church courts, and the ever-present layers of deeply ingrained local customs and the prevailing superstitions and fears of the time, which could dramatically influence accusations and judgments, especially in cases like witchcraft. You see a sturdy-looking wooden whipping post set firmly in the ground in a small open area near the side of a building, ropes potentially attached. You quickly avert your gaze. You feel a sudden strong urge to be incredibly polite and deferential to everyone you encounter, maintain a quiet demeanor. Perhaps avoid any unnecessary eye contact that might be misinterpreted, and certainly absolutely positively do not engage in any form of lighthearted, rebellious behavior, disruptive antics, or any kind of public act that might be perceived as questioning authority or social norms. Your modern understanding of what constitutes tough consequences for breaking rules just got an entirely new level of painful public and inventive historical context. This era, regardless of kingdom or year within the period, was most definitely not shy about making a prominent, painful, and frequently horrifying public point of those deemed to be offenders. Let's delve a little more into how exactly religion factored into this intense era of severity, especially with the immense power of the church looming over medieval life. You're still mentally wandering through the various sights, sounds, and smells of a bustling, contradictory medieval Europe, a place of immense faith and soaring cathedrals, yet also rough and tumble daily life, muddy paths, and those sometimes grim secular forms of justice we've explored, from public shaming devices to agonizing executions overseen by local lords or the king's men. But you quickly become acutely aware that in this specific historical era, more so than perhaps in many others we've touched upon, there was another immense power wielding significant, sometimes dominant influence over society and its inhabitants, an authority that claimed jurisdiction not just over your actions in this worldly life, but explicitly claimed dominion and authority over your very soul, the Catholic Church, and perceived offenses directly against God. Sacred things or official religious doctrine and dogma could often lead to punishments that were just as, if not sometimes even more terrifying, relentless, and final than those handed down by any earthly king, duke, or lord, because they involved both spiritual condemnation and physical destruction. Throughout human history, across a vast multitude of cultures, the concepts of religion, divine law, and earthly human law have been profoundly, often inextricably intertwined. We've seen glimpses of this in our journey in Aztec society. Sacrilege wasn't just disrespect. It was a potentially capital crime because it was seen as directly threatening the vital cosmic order required by the gods for the empire's prosperity and existence. In ancient Egypt, upholding the cosmic principles of Ma'at was presented as a divine imperative and duty of the pharaoh, thereby making disrespect towards sacred temples, divine images, or engaging in false speech perjury offenses, not just against society, but against the divine mandate itself, sometimes leading to severe physical punishment, as we saw. But in medieval Europe, with the rise and pervasive power of the unified Catholic Church across many different kingdoms and cultures, this intersection became formalized and highly structured. The Church developed its own extensive legal system known as canon law. A body of internal ecclesiastical rules and regulations derived from scripture decrees of popes and councils. Alongside this, the Church established its own court system, often called ecclesiastical courts. While these courts undeniably had primary jurisdiction over clergy members, priests, monks, bishops, and the like, their reach often extended significantly to cover lay people as well, for a very wide array of matters deemed spiritual, moral, or tied to religious duty and practice. This powerful intersection of religion and law in the medieval West meant that crimes from a societal perspective weren't merely defined or prosecuted as offenses against the king, against your neighbor, or simply disruptions to secular civil order. They could and crucially be framed, defined, investigated, and prosecuted as sins, direct offenses against God himself. And as offenses against divine authority, they were thus subject to judgment, not only from secular earthly authorities, but simultaneously from powerful religious institutions and their specific court systems. A broad category of human behavior and belief therefore potentially fell under the Church's significant purview. This included offenses like blasphemy, using impious speech insulting God, or sacred things cursing by sacred names. Heresy, holding beliefs, expressing ideas, or practicing forms of worship that were fundamentally contrary to the official established doctrines and dogma of the Catholic Church. Witchcraft, which over time, especially from the later medieval period onwards, became increasingly viewed and persecuted as a form of heresy, essentially involving a pact with the devil, or a rejection of God's authority in favor of demonic power, adultery, and other sexual sins, as matters violating the sanctity of marriage and divine commandment, and a wide range of other perceived moral failings and transgressions against church teachings and expected piety. The punishments handed down by ecclesiastical courts could encompass a range of penalties. On the less severe end, at least physically, they might involve mandatory spiritual penances assigned to the offender, requiring them to fast for a specific period, undertake lengthy or numerous required prayers, perform acts of charity, or undertake a penitential pilgrimage to a holy site, which could nonetheless be physically arduous and dangerous. Punishments could also include various forms of public shaming within the community, such as being forced to stand during church services wearing a penitential garment, or displaying a symbol of your sin, exclusion from certain religious sacraments, fines payable to the church, or even forms of corporal punishment, like beatings often lighter than those from secular courts, but still physically inflicted. However, the really heavy, terrifying consequences emerged and were consistently applied when the church authorities deemed an individual's beliefs to be a fundamental and active threat to the core of Christian faith and its power structure, particularly in cases of persistent, unrepentant heresy. This brings us to a very important and grim mainstream historical fact. The campaign against heresy became particularly organized, pervasive, and systematically brutal with the establishment and widespread implementation of the medieval Inquisition, beginning significantly in the 12th century, expanding in subsequent centuries and manifesting in various forms across Europe. The Inquisition wasn't a single building or body. It was a system of specialized tribunals, judges, and officials specifically designed and tasked by the papacy with investigating, prosecuting, and punishing heresy within specific regions. The processes of the Inquisition were notoriously secret and often severely skewed against the accused. Procedures frequently involved secret denunciations the accused might not even know who accused them, initially prolonged and often intimidating interrogations, and infamously and tragically the institutionalized use of torture, which is understandably difficult to describe, but a grim reality that existed as a means to extract confessions and names of supposed accomplices. Torture, definitely not PG, was used widely by secular and ecclesiastical courts throughout the period and beyond. Often justified by convoluted legal logic, here specifically aimed at breaking a suspect and extracting information deemed necessary to save their soul or protect the church. The accused often had incredibly limited rights, often unable to call witnesses in their defense if those witnesses were deemed potentially sympathetic to heresy and unable to confront their accusers. If you were unfortunate enough to be accused of heresy and after the process were found guilty, refuse to recant meaning to formally, publicly, and sincerely renounce your heretical beliefs and pledge absolute loyalty to orthodox doctrine. Or if you had been found guilty before, recanted, and then were caught again as a repeat offender, relapsed heretic, the outcome was typically swift and terrifying. In these most serious cases of unrepentant or relapsed heresy, the church itself, while conducting the trial and declaring the guilt and unrepentance, did officially carry out the ultimate final punishment itself. Instead, the guilty individual was formally relinquished or handed over to the secular authorities of the state, with the full and clear understanding by all parties involved, including the secular ruler, who was bound by law and often fervent belief to support the church, that the legally mandated punishment for unrepentant heresy throughout most of medieval Europe was death by burning at the stake. The act of being burned at the stake in the theological and legal logic of the time held dual symbolic meaning. It was seen both as a final complete purification of the heretic's physical body, which was deemed corrupted by their false beliefs or influence, and just as powerfully as a horrific, unforgettable warning, a blazing example for all onlookers about the absolute, terrifying, and inescapable consequences of holding beliefs contrary to official church doctrine. Imagine for a chilling moment completing a formal legal and religious process, just to be literally passed via official paperwork, or decree from the custody of one authority figure, a church inquisitor or bishop, into the custody of another, a king's official, or Lord's guard, specifically for that secular authority, to then tie you to a stake and set you on fire as mandated by law, because your internal beliefs were deemed fundamentally unacceptable by the religious authority. That represents an extraordinary, almost surreal level of bureaucracy, inter-authority coordination, and predetermined cruelty, all directed at a perceived threat to spiritual uniformity and authority. Simply being accused of heresy, whether you were actually guilty according to the church's definition or not, was an incredibly precarious and potentially ruinous situation. Even appearing to hold or express slightly unorthodox views on relatively obscure theological points, discussing scripture in a way not approved or associating with people suspected of dissenting beliefs, could potentially attract the attention of an inquisitor and lead to a full investigation. Once you were within the sight of the Inquisition's tribunal, it was profoundly difficult to extract yourself unscathed. Even if under intense pressure or duress, you chose to recant your beliefs and formally confessed your errors, the consequences were often severe and long-lasting. You might face sentences of lifelong imprisonment in harsh conditions, be compelled to wear a distinctive public garment, such as a prominent yellow cross sewn onto your outer clothing, for the remainder of your life, marking you perpetually as a former heretic in the eyes of the community, and typically face the confiscation of all your property by the church or the secular authorities who collaborated with the Inquisition. The chilling possibility existed that even if your soul was deemed potentially saved by your forced confession, your earthly life freedom and possessions were utterly forfeit. Historians continue to delve into and debate the multifaceted primary motivations behind the intense, often incredibly violent persecution of heretics during the Middle Ages and subsequent periods. Was the overriding motivation purely religious, stemming from a genuine, deeply held conviction on the part of church authorities and many rulers that heresy represented a spiritual cancer, a fundamental threat to the true path to salvation for believers, and that combating it was a necessary act of protecting souls and purifying the church? Or were political motivations frequently paramount, with secular rulers cynically or practically using charges of heresy, often facilitated by the church, as convenient legal justification to identify, persecute, eliminate political opponents, confiscate their property to enrich the crown, and consolidate their own power base under the cloak of defending religious orthodoxy? Or were significant socioeconomic factors driving it, with both the church hierarchy and secular rulers sometimes seeing prosecutions, especially of wealthier individuals or groups with property, as a straightforward means to seize valuable assets from the condemned heretics and their families? Most likely, and modern scholarship tends towards this view. The intense drive behind combating heresy was a complex, shifting, and often deeply intertwined mix of all these motivations operating differently, depending on the specific location, time period, and individuals involved. But regardless of the precise mix of motivations, the devastating result for those accused and persecuted as heretics was undeniably brutal, horrifying, and often involved utter ruin or agonizing death. It is important to remember, while the medieval Inquisition stands out, that the concept of religiously based laws and their accompanying punishments was by no means confined just to Christianity or medieval Europe, as we saw briefly with the Aztecs and Egyptians. In many ancient and historical societies, globally legal codes were often explicitly seen as divinely inspired or mandated by religious authorities, and crimes were very frequently framed and understood not only as violations against fellow humans or the state, but fundamentally as sins, offenses against powerful deities or cosmic principles. Blasphemy insulting divine beings or sacred concepts, and sacrilege desecrating sacred objects or places were recurring serious offenses in numerous cultures throughout history, including vast stretches of the ancient Near East aspects of classical Roman religion, and certainly historically within various periods and interpretations of Islamic law. Depending on the specific legal tradition, cultural context, and historical time period, these offenses against the divine could be punishable by incredibly severe corporal punishment, or in many cases, outright death. Let's add a particularly quirky or fringe tidbit, specifically related to those seemingly minor religious transgressions in medieval Europe. Beyond the capital crimes of heresy, there were intricate layers of specific religious laws, dictates, and detailed asterisk penances, asterisk prescribed by church authorities for various, what we might see as incredibly minor, or everyday transgressions against established religious rules and practices, sometimes policed through the confessional. Medieval penitentials, which were handbooks and manuals specifically written for priests to use as guides when hearing confessions, listed specific penances for a vast catalog of different sins. These penances were the spiritual punishment for sins confessed. They could range from, say, mandatory fasting on only bread and water for a certain number of days each week for a specified period, to lengthy requirements to recite a very large number of psalms daily, to temporary exclusion from being allowed to receive the important sacrament of communion, to even potentially severe penalties applied within church courts for offenses like persistently missing compulsory church services without a legitimate convincing reason, or perhaps even for eating meat on days when fasting and abstaining from meat was religiously prohibited without dispensation. There are even mentions within religious manuals and texts about assigning penances or religious counseling for deemed lustful thoughts, though enforcing and punishing purely internal thoughts without corresponding actions is inherently tricky legally. So it often depended on whether such thoughts were admitted during confession or were seen as potentially leading to or reflecting problematic outward behavior. It feels almost like navigating a cosmic point system or divine balance sheet for everyday life. Except unlike modern point systems, accumulation or conviction on religious violations here had serious enforceable consequences, representing not merely a spiritual demerit points balance, but a real concrete penalty that could be levied by a church court or required as an official religious penance to reconcile with the divine and the community. You walk past a large imposing cathedral now, its magnificent stone spires reaching high towards the sky, a truly dominant and unmistakable physical and symbolic presence within the town dwarfing many other buildings. You see priests, monks, or nuns in their distinctive habits moving within its grounds or on nearby streets. Visible figures of both spiritual guidance, presumed piety, but also undeniable authority within the structure of the society. But having just absorbed this layer of history, you are also acutely aware that within those sacred walls, or in a quiet room nearby, perhaps in a bishop's palace or a local inquisitor's chamber, a very different kind of justice might be quietly dispensed compared to the rowdy secular court in the marketplace. One focused piercingly on the state of your immortal soul, the purity of your inner beliefs, and your unwavering adherence to a specific set of divine doctrines. The very air seems to feel heavy with a pervasive sense of collective piety, certainly, but also carrying an undeniable potential for intense spiritual and moral judgment from a powerful institution. You find yourself very quickly deciding that dwelling too deeply on complex, potentially ambiguous theological questions is probably an unnecessary and highly risky intellectual exercise in this particular era and location. Better to stick firmly to contemplating much simpler, safer things, like wondering whether that freshly baked bread you can smell nearby seems truly fresh and worth spending a few coins on, or observing the practical aspects of the medieval economy. Navigating this world safely, it becomes clear, requires not just rigorously obeying the patchwork of secular laws enacted by local lords and distant kings, but perhaps even more fundamentally, adhering strictly outwardly and inwardly to the defined doctrines and behavioral expectations of the dominant religious faith, lest you face the potentially overwhelming wrath of a system like the Inquisition that was grimly paradoxically designed to save your soul from damnation by sometimes deliberately and brutally destroying your physical body through the fires of a public execution. Not exactly a compelling marketing slogan one might choose for a modern religious recruitment drive. Let's take our historical journey further eastward now. Perhaps moving to a completely different continent, with a different set of cultural, societal, and legal norms. Perhaps the vast ancient empires of Asia had different ideas about the nature of law punishment and the breaking of rules. Though based on historical trends, gentleness is likely not the primary characteristic we will encounter. Leaving behind the spires and dungeons of medieval Europe, the cold stone of castles and the muddy chaos of local courts, you feel the air shift significantly once more. That damp chill recedes, entirely replaced by a feeling of ancient, deep-seated calm, layered with settled dust and perhaps the faint distant smell of terraced rice paddies somewhere, or the distinct, slightly sweet, smoky aroma of burning incense drifting from temples or homes. You find yourself stepping in your mind's eye onto a different continent altogether, moving into the vast, long, and complex histories of East Asia, specifically turning our focus towards powerful, enduring imperial states that existed for centuries, such as dynastic China, or regions profoundly influenced by its culture like ancient Korea or Japan, particularly during their more centralized feudal periods. Here, immense imperial dynasties ruled, rose, and fell, and they developed legal systems that were often extraordinarily sophisticated, remarkably bureaucratic, intricately codified, and in some striking ways perhaps even more elaborate and minutely defined in their various forms of punishment than anything we've explored so far. While the specific details of the legal codes, administrative structures, and methods of punishment varied sometimes considerably between different dynasties within a single country like China, under the Han versus the Tang versus the Qing, and certainly differed in nuances between countries like China, Korea, and Japan. A powerful common thread often running through many East Asian legal systems for vast periods of their history was a strong, deep-seated emphasis on extensively codified law. Rules were often written down in highly detailed statutes and codes. There was usually an equally strong belief in centralized authority stemming from the person of the emperor, who was often seen as holding a mandate from heaven, or as the literal source of law, making imperial decrees paramount, which enabled more uniformity in legal application, at least in theory, and particularly in periods of strong central rule, than the fragmented authorities of medieval Europe. And alongside these elements was an explicit, widely held belief in the significant power and necessity of often harsh punishment as a fundamental tool for maintaining large-scale social order, upholding hierarchical structures, deterring potential crime through fear of severe consequences, and demonstrating the absolute authority of the state. Unlike the often messy, socially layered justice of medieval Europe, or even the stratification within Roman law, though status still played a huge role in East Asia in many historical periods and states, here there was a movement towards a more ostensibly uniform application of codified punishments based strictly on what the law stated for a specific offense, though wealth status and official connections certainly still heavily influenced outcomes in practice. You walk through incredibly busy, vibrant ancient streets, perhaps in Chang'an during the Tang Dynasty, or Edo during the Tokugawa shogunate, hearing languages you absolutely do not understand, seeing architectural styles, clothing, and daily customs vastly different from Europe or Mesoamerica. The feeling of being watched, or at least of needing to conform rigidly to external expectations, is definitely present again, similar to Tenochtitlan. But this time it often feels less like a neighbor's moral scrutiny, or an official's sudden arbitrary power surge, and more systematic, pervasive, and bureaucratic. Like you could get into incredibly deep trouble just for an administrative error, like inadvertently filling out a form with incorrect calligraphy if such forms were applicable to your current existence, underlining a deep cultural valuing of order and precision, extending into even minor regulations. Corporal punishment was an incredibly common and fundamental aspect of legal systems across large parts of East Asia for vast periods, and it was often meticulously regulated and administered. The asterisk bamboo caning asterisk, or asterisk beating with a stick asterisk, usually with a specially designed flat or sometimes rounded bamboo or wooden stick, was arguably asterisk, the asterisk most standard ubiquitous form of judicial punishment for a vast spectrum of offenses. This ranged from relatively minor administrative errors or failures to meet required standards, breaches of lesser regulations, minor public order offenses, to petty theft or moderate misbehavior. The severity of the caning was precisely and explicitly stipulated by the codified law itself, often defined down to the exact asterisk number asterisk of blows the convicted person was to receive. The number could range considerably, perhaps a few dozen strokes for a lesser infraction, say 30 or 40, rising through various grades to 100, or even significantly more, 100, 120, potentially higher numbers in some codes for more serious but still not capital crimes. The blows were typically delivered to the offender's buttocks or back, while the legal intent behind judicial caning was often presented as non-lethal, intended to cause significant pain and physical correction, deterrence, and public humiliation without being designed to kill. In practice, particularly if the punishment involved high numbers of strokes, say over 80 or 100, or if the convicted person was elderly, physically weak, already ill, or suffered blows administered by a particularly enthusiastic, poorly trained, or intentionally corrupt official wielding the stick with excessive force or striking vital areas, severe caning could absolutely cause permanent injury, disability, irreversible internal damage, or tragically lead directly to the offender's death. Imagine seeing a specific penalty chart and realizing your punishment isn't measured in time or money, but by a precise specific number and a heavy, sturdy piece of wood wielded by an official. Ah, yes. After consulting Section 3, Article 19 of the Imperial Code for failing to display adequate respect towards the local prefect during his procession, your offense regrettably requires 80 strokes of the medium cane. Please step forward and adopt the required posture. It brings a stark reality to legal code adherence. This prevalence and regulation of judicial caning leads to a fundamental mainstream historical fact about East Asian law, particularly powerful in China. Under numerous dynasties, especially evolving and formalizing significantly, from the Tang Dynasty 7 to 10 centuries onwards, the system of judicial beatings, often with bamboo, became one of the *5 standard legal punishments, codified within the formal imperial law. It sat alongside other punishments like tattooing, branding, forced labor, exile, and execution. The severity of the caning, as noted, was meticulously graded based on the specific offense clearly detailed in the imperial law codes. It was precisely recorded as part of judicial procedure. Caning wasn't just a random act of violence by an official. It was a formalized, central bureaucratically administered tool of judicial discipline control and punishment, applied across the vast empire for centuries. Methods of execution in East Asia for the most serious crimes could also be particularly graphic, agonizing, and deliberately designed for maximum public deterrence and visual spectacle, similar in intent if not method to other cultures we've explored. Beheading, relatively quick and effective, was a common method used for many serious non-treasonous capital crimes like general murder or serious rebellion depending on specific circumstance. But certain offenses deemed incredibly heinous, striking profoundly at the foundations of the family, the social order, or the imperial power, called for significantly more extreme measures intended to prolong suffering and inflict deep dishonor on the condemned and their lineage. This brings us to *Lingqi*. *Lingqi*, often controversially translated in earlier historical accounts and Western descriptions as death by 1,000 cuts or slow slicing, was a codified method of execution historically used in China for crimes considered exceptionally atrocious, reserved typically for things like high treason, especially severe plots against the emperor or dynasty, or the absolute most unforgivable form of patricide and parricide, killing one's parent or paternal grandparent. It was officially used for several centuries, though accounts suggest it may have been relatively rarely applied, primarily as an ultimate dreaded deterrent and symbolic act against the most monstrous crimes in their view. While the exact specific process and nature of Lingqi is still actively debated and studied by historians and scholars, arguments persist about precisely how many cuts were involved in different eras. Was it truly hundreds or a symbolic high number often administered after preliminary acts? Whether the cuts were primarily applied to a living person or commenced after they had already died from other initial blows. Later accounts suggest measures might be taken to end life earlier in the process, while maintaining the dismemberment for symbolic display, and whether some foreign historical descriptions exaggerated its prolonged, agonizing nature. The underlying concept was undeniably horrifying and specific. A public, agonizingly slow, step-by-step mutilation and dismemberment of the body. Even keeping the description within PG-13 bounds and focusing only on the core grim concept, the intentional public act of gradually cutting and dissecting a body as a legally prescribed punishment for a crime, is enough to instill a profound sense of terror and an intense desire to live the most impeccably blameless, respectful life imaginable in such a society, avoiding any action that might conceivably fall into such an extreme category. Other forms of elaborate and painful punishments existed in East Asian legal systems, often carefully designed like some Roman ones to fit the crime symbolically, or to inflict specific related forms of suffering and dishonor. For forgery, specific types of serious fraud or certain categories of theft, especially of items marking status or privilege punishment, sometimes involved physically branding or tattooing the offender's face. This wasn't just a random mark. Often, specific characters identifying their crime would be indelibly inked onto their skin. This created a permanent public mark of shame instantly identifiable by anyone they encountered, similar in effect to other cultures that used branding, but sometimes featuring intricate characters detailing their transgression. For crimes considered fundamentally disrespectful towards elders, patriarchal figures, or legitimate imperial authority. Acts seen as profoundly undermining the core Confucian principles underpinning society in China and influenced areas. Punishments could be specifically designed to force the offender into physically humiliating or demeaning positions, or inflict pain in ways that directly symbolize their transgression against hierarchical respect. Here's a unique, sometimes fantastical, quirky, or perhaps strictly fringe tidbit, drawn more from historical anecdotes, folklore, or cautionary tales surrounding officials and powerful figures, rather than necessarily representing widespread standard codified legal procedure for commoners. These accounts describe specific, often highly creative and ironically appropriate punishments, supposedly meted out particularly for cases of flagrant official corruption among members of the bureaucracy, or exceptionally cunning high-level criminals who defied easy capture. While it's debated whether these punishments were routinely carried out in practice, or were more products of historical narrative designed to serve as vivid warnings, or express societal disapproval through wishful, often darkly satisfying concepts of ironic retribution against abusers of power, the ideas are certainly bizarre and memorable. One such type of account which surfaces in historical writings or dramas, meant to serve as cautionary examples of fighting corruption, describes corrupt officials found guilty of embezzling vast sums being sentenced to be forced to drink molten silver or other precious metals, the idea being a horrific internal mirroring of their insatiable greed for wealth, or being executed by having their stomachs literally cut open and then filled with heavy weights or stones symbolically representing how they had burdened or weighed down the common people with oppressive taxes, regulations, and demands due to their corruption. While the physical reality and frequency of such punishments as standard legal procedures for anything less than absolutely top-tier traitors or unparalleled villains is highly questionable among historians, the concept is undeniably strange and vividly reflects a deep cultural disapproval of specific forms of wrongdoing, particularly abuses of trust and power from within the ruling or administrative class. Imagine the courtroom sentencing in this theoretical system. Given your immense guilt and betrayal of public trust through corruption, you are hereby sentenced not merely to execution but specifically to the symbolic consumption of superheated precious metals. Yes, good luck with that process. Next case. The sheer symbolic specificity speaks volumes about what that society deeply reviled. A notable aspect of many historical East Asian legal systems driven by that principle of centralized authority and codified rules was the focus on establishing guilt through a formal investigative process. This could involve dedicated investigators, layers of judges at various levels, district, prefectural, provincial, and high imperial courts, and the creation and preservation of detailed written records of accusations, testimonies, and judgments, sometimes requiring detailed calligraphy for the paperwork itself. However, while seemingly formal and structured, the actual process for the accused was very often heavily skewed against them. The legal systems frequently placed a high premium on obtaining a formal confession from the accused, often seeing it as a crucial, sometimes essential component for a solid conviction. And the methods used to obtain that confession could be relentlessly brutal, routinely involving state-sanctioned torture as a standard part of the investigative process. Various forms of beating, bone compression, suspension, and other painful methods justified in the eyes of the state and its laws as a necessary means to uncover truth and elicit admission of guilt. The goal was simple: extract the confession, and the means to achieve this were often severe and without effective appeal for the victim undergoing interrogation. Another incredibly important and pervasive concept, particularly powerful within traditional Chinese law and governance and influencing neighboring regions, was the concept of collective responsibility, sometimes known as associative punishment. For serious crimes against the state, especially capital crimes like high treason against the emperor, serious rebellion, or attempting assassination, the legal consequences frequently extended far, far beyond the immediate perpetrator. Under various imperial laws, not only the individual found guilty, but often their extended family as well, potentially including parents, siblings, adult children, uncles, aunts, and even sometimes more distant relatives, depending on the severity of the offense and specific law, could face severe repercussions. This might range from being reduced to a degraded status, lifelong forced internal exile, or sometimes for the most profound acts of treason, even facing the death penalty alongside the primary offender, or being condemned to state-owned slavery. This harsh system was fundamentally intended as an extreme measure to deter any thoughts of disloyalty, suppressed dissent, before it could fester by targeting entire lineages suspected of potential subversion, and instill an absolute premium on unwavering loyalty to the emperor and state. It made people legally responsible, not only for their own individual actions, but terrifyingly accountable for the actions, associations, or perceived lack of loyalty of their entire familial unit. Suddenly, the notion of gathering your entire extended family for a high-stakes, maybe even annual reunion feels less about catching up and more like attending a mandatory political vetting session, where any individual's misstep could have unimaginable, devastating legal consequences for absolutely everyone present. Okay, everyone, let's try and play charades together harmoniously this year, shall we? And just remember Aunt Mei Ling, if Uncle Bao somehow manages to get arrested for jaywalking on the way here, well, based on the imperial statute concerning lineage accountability for petty municipal code violations by fourth cousins removed, the entire rest of us are getting deported to the harsh frontier. So please just, no jaywalking, all right? The collective anxiety must have been constant for families of any potential status or prominence. You walk now through a bustling marketplace in this East Asian setting, the air filled with the aromas of countless spices. You can't name the rustling of incredibly fine silk fabrics draped in vibrant colors, the sight of calligraphers meticulously writing out documents, or artistry with brushes and ink. Delicate ceramics, elaborate carvings. The immense precision, artistry, and dedication to craft that defined elements of these cultures are profoundly evident in everyday life. And yes, Even it seems reflected in the painstakingly detailed regulations and punishments described within their complex legal codes. You see officials wearing distinctive, often conical or specifically shaped hats, moving through the crowds carrying scrolls, enforcing rules and maintaining order through their very visible presence and the knowledge of the rigorous system behind them. There's a deeply ingrained sense of formal politeness and palpable respect for authority that you feel emanating from the people, likely a respect born and reinforced out of centuries of strong imperial rule, complex bureaucratic systems, and the ever-present knowledge that the consequences for stepping out of line, questioning authority, or breaking codified laws were almost always severe, consistently applied at least in theory, and often carried out with systematic, undeniable precision. From judicial caning to extreme forms of execution and family consequence. You decide that much like Tenochtitlan, keeping your head down, maintaining an expression of polite impassivity, being absolutely respectful to anyone remotely resembling an official, and certainly under no circumstances whatsoever, ever uttering a single word of complaint about the intricate system of taxes, seems like not merely a wise approach, but probably the absolute only rational path for safety. Your mental journey through various iterations of often bizarre, consistently brutal historical punishments across global cultures is undeniably nearing its conclusion, now bringing into sharp relief just how differently human societies have defined, judged, and addressed wrongdoing. But before we gently fade out, there's one more category of consequence that seems remarkably universal across many of these historical societies, a particular form of punishment not always centered on physical pain or the loss of life, but arguably just as devastating in its own unique way. A look at the power and prevalence of public shaming rituals across different cultures, before hopefully finally and truly drifting off towards sleep and modern safety. You've taken quite the comprehensive journey tonight, mentally traversing through incredibly intricate, often terrifying legal landscapes across different continents and distinct epochs of human history. You've visited the stark, socially stratified world of the Aztecs, where status determined life and death, and even minor personal offenses carried the weight of potential swift punishment alongside brutal capital crimes. You've walked through the sunny but perhaps physically dangerous world of ancient Egypt, where property rights and truthfulness in courts were upheld, with the terrifying possibility of permanent bodily mutilation. You've observed the impressive, legally sophisticated but also occasionally bizarrely specific and often cruelly stratified justice of Rome, where even capital punishment could involve unique ritualistic horrors. You've experienced the more decentralized, theatrical, and brutally inventive approach to law and consequence in medieval Europe, with its public hangings, drawing and quartering humiliating stocks, and even astonishingly trials for animals. And you've peered into the deeply bureaucratic, highly codified, sometimes physically extreme, and often collectively applied punishments within powerful imperial states in East Asia, from meticulous judicial caning to devastating forms of execution, like lynching and familial consequence. You've seen how fundamentally varied, how often astonishingly inventive, and how frequently horrifying humanity has been throughout its recorded history, in its tireless efforts to define what constitutes breaking a rule, enforce order, deter future wrongdoing, and punish those deemed offenders according to the values, fears, and power structures prevalent in their time and place. But threading through nearly all of these disparate legal systems and historical periods, there appears to be one category of punishment that seems almost universally present, utilized by societies across continents and ages. This method of consequences isn't always about inflicting permanent physical pain or causing immediate death. Instead, it's often deeply aimed at something potentially just as if not more devastating for an individual's life and future within their community: the intentional act of inflicting public humiliation, the formal visible practice of shaming. It is a fundamental way of reinforcing societal norms, punishing breaches not necessarily with physical wounds, but with the potent psychological damage of public scorn, marking the transgressor in the eyes of everyone around them. Stepping back just slightly from the specific grandeur of imperial courts and the grim sights of execution or corporal correction that defined some of the heavier penalties, you can imagine finding yourself standing in various public spaces throughout history. Picturing a medieval town square at market day, the central green of a small colonial village from a few centuries ago, a busy market plaza in a distant land. We didn't specifically detail but nonetheless utilized similar tactics. In these scenarios, the primary focus isn't solely on the physical method of punishment or the ending of a life, but on the active exposure of making the offender's wrongdoing publicly undeniably visible. and thereby deliberately subjecting them to the collective judgment, disapproval, gossip, and active scorn of their surrounding community. We have already caught glimpses of this powerful societal tool throughout our journey. Remember the requirement for public head shaving as a punishment for public drunkenness for commoners in the Aztec Empire. That was a clear act of deliberate shaming. The lost hair, a temporary yet highly visible mark of your offense for everyone you encountered to see. And of course those ubiquitous sturdy structures like the stocks and the pillory that were common fixtures across medieval Europe and later in colonial settlements. These were much more than mere temporary holding cells or physical restraints. They were quite literally designed as public stages for formalized disgrace. Imagine being firmly locked into a wooden frame like a pillory, forced to stand or sit hunched over with your head and hands exposed, utterly unable to hide your face from anyone passing by. Meanwhile, your neighbors, your friends, perhaps now estranged by your disgrace acquaintances and complete strangers walk past seeing you restrained. They are free to point at you, laugh at your misfortune, shout insults, make disapproving remarks, and famously frequently throw overripe or spoiled food, or yes, sometimes even less pleasant things, at you for hours or days on end. This was designed to be more than simply physically uncomfortable. It was a profoundly effective form of public psychological and social punishment, intentionally crafted to deeply humiliate you and damage your reputation, potentially irreparably, within the vital context of your close-knit community. It's perhaps the historical equivalent of going spectacularly viral for all the absolute worst possible reasons in today's social media landscape. Except instead of being able to delete the app or just logging off, you are physically bolted to a sturdy wooden frame with no means of escape or even momentary hiding. Another classic infamous example of public shaming, particularly well documented in medieval and post-medieval Europe, and then later transferred to places like colonial America, was the cucking stool or dunking stool. While this device was sometimes used especially in early iterations for dishonest tradespeople as a physical manifestation of their deceit cooling their deceptive heat, it became most famously, or more accurately, infamously deployed as a legally sanctioned punishment overwhelmingly against women accused of being scolds. This label applied broadly to women who were perceived by the authorities as troublesome, overly argumentative, quarrelsome, gossipy, or otherwise stepping outside the very tightly constrained expectations of appropriate female behavior in public and within their households. The punishment typically involved strapping the accused woman firmly into a chair that was securely fastened to the end of a long plank. This plank was then pivoted or swung out over a river, a pond, or a large barrel of water, and the woman was repeatedly and intentionally dunked or submerged into the water. While it wasn't explicitly or primarily designed as a lethal punishment, though, depending on the temperature of the water, the health of the person, or the skill intent of those administering the dunkings, it could unfortunately sometimes result in injury, illness, or accidental drowning. It was profoundly uncomfortable, deeply humiliating, often painful, and a clear, widely witnessed message to the community, intended to forcefully and visibly punish violations of expected gender roles and deter others from similar behavior deemed socially disruptive or stepping beyond established bounds for women. Imagine being physically restrained and publicly waterboarded, essentially simply for, say, telling a few particularly juicy but inconvenient stories about your neighbors, or perhaps engaging in a spirited argument that was deemed overly vocal by the local male authorities. The severity highlights the fear of unrestrained public female expression in many historical periods. This prevalence of physically public shaming rituals, involving devices like the stocks, pillories, or forced, often degrading parades through the streets where the offender was mocked and abused by bystanders, is indeed a well-established, widespread, mainstream historical fact documented in legal records across countless cultures globally, and utilized for centuries spanning ancient times through medieval, colonial, and even into early modern periods in some places. They were applied for an astonishingly broad spectrum of offenses, ranging from incredibly minor misdemeanors and breaches of decorum, all the way up to being integrated into punishments for more serious moral transgressions, or even certain felonies, as part of a larger sequence of consequences before or after corporal punishment or execution. The underlying undeniable purpose across all these disparate cultures and times was remarkably consistent and clear, powerful deterrence for the assembled masses witnessing it, and stark, unambiguous public denunciation and degradation of the individual offender within the community that defined them. Beyond the specific physical devices designed for restraint and exposure, shaming throughout history often involved forcing offenders into public visibility in ways that immediately identified them, and often specifically highlighted their crime to anyone who saw them. Think back to that prominent, now almost literary example from American literature. Hester Prynne being forced to wear the infamous scarlet letter A publicly as a mark of her adultery. While the details of Nathaniel Hawthorne's specific story were fictionalized, the core historical practice that inspired it, forcing individuals who had committed certain moral or civil offenses to wear specific highly identifiable clothing patches or signs that explicitly detailed their crime, was very real and existed in various forms in many different historical locations, particularly in later periods. This could involve being required to wear a cloak of a specific color. Colors often had symbolic meaning tied to shame or low status, a distinctive, sometimes ridiculed hat, or most directly being made to wear a physical sign hung around your neck, or pinned to your clothing explicitly stating the crime you had been convicted of. In certain historical European towns, individuals formally declared bankrupt due to reckless or dishonest financial dealings were sometimes compelled by law or local custom to sit physically exposed upon a designated stone of shame, located in a prominent public square or outside a financial building, where all passers-by would know their failure and disgrace. In early colonial America, groups like Quakers or Baptists, who refused to conform to the dominant Puritan religious practices and civil laws, might be subjected to forms of public shaming, like being publicly whipped, or made to stand in the stock specifically because of their religious descent alongside being formally banished from the settlement. The absolutely consistent, powerful thread connecting all these diverse practices across cultures and centuries is the core intent using mandatory public visibility, distinctive markers, and unavoidable community exposure to force the individual to embody, explain, and be perpetually defined by their transgression for the benefit of reminding the rest of the community of the rules and consequences. Here is one more, perhaps slightly different quirky or fringe tidbit involving historical shaming, bringing us back briefly eastward. In certain historical periods and regional legal practices within China, and sometimes influencing neighboring areas, particularly for minor offenders deemed less dangerous, or whose crimes warranted harsh physical correction, but perhaps not permanent branding or severe caning numbering over a certain threshold. There was a method involving forcing the offender to wear a large, cumbersome, heavy wooden collar around their neck and shoulders. This device was known by various names, one being the Kang or Ticha. Essentially similar in its effect to a portable pillory, this substantial, often several feet wide and quite heavy wooden collar had holes that fastened around the offender's neck. Unlike stocks or a standard pillory where you were fixed in place in the square, the Kang was typically worn constantly by the condemned individual for a period ranging from a few days to many weeks, and sometimes even months, forcing them to walk around with it or attempting to sleep in it. Because the collar was so wide and bulky, it made it literally impossible for the person wearing it to raise their hands to feed themselves, scratch an itch on their face, defend themselves from flies, or even lie down comfortably. This forced dependency often required them to rely on the charity or mandated assistance of others, including family members or strangers, even just to eat. While appearing superficially less physically brutal than outright mutilation or lethal punishment, the constant crushing physical burden, the inescapable public visibility wherever they went, everyone could see they were an offender. The physical discomfort and the deep reliance on others for basic needs combined to create an incredibly intense, prolonged, and demoralizing form of both physical hardship and profound psychological and social punishment. Imagine trying to navigate daily life, trying to earn a few coins, trying to maintain any shred of dignity, or even just trying to eat a bowl of soup with a multi-foot-wide heavy wooden yoke locked around your neck and shoulders. It was a persistent living reminder of your disgrace to yourself and everyone around you. Historians today continue to debate and analyze the true overall effectiveness of public shaming as a long-term crime deterrent compared to other forms of punishment, such as incarceration, which became more prominent later severe physical penalties or executions. Did the very real and often intense experience of public disgrace genuinely prevent future crime across the board, perhaps by instilling profound fear of repeat humiliation or driving a genuine change in behavior? Or did public shaming perhaps function more primarily as a tool to reinforce community norms to the wider populace, publicly demonstrating the community's disapproval and providing a visceral sense of immediate public justice and perhaps retribution against the offender? For some individuals, that shattering experience of public disgrace and losing face might indeed have been a powerfully negative motivation, compelling them to strive harder to conform and avoid any future transgressions. But for others, the harsh, permanent social stigma left by public shaming might have had the opposite effect, making it incredibly difficult, perhaps impossible to ever fully reintegrate into their society or community, in a positive way, potentially leading them towards further marginalization, despair, and ironically a greater likelihood of resorting to more crime out of necessity or alienation. It remains a complex, debated aspect of historical justice. And perhaps most interestingly, even here in our incredibly different modern world, while physical devices of historical shaming like the stocks or kang are thankfully largely confined to being viewed in museums as historical artifacts, though remnants of similar practices linger in some parts of the world. The fundamental underlying concept, the impulse towards public shaming and denunciation of those who violate perceived societal norms, unquestionably persists in different, often new forms significantly facilitated by contemporary technology. Social media call-outs and pile-ons targeting individuals for perceived wrongdoings or offensive statements, viral online petitions demanding that individuals face professional or personal consequences for behaviors, public figures being cancelled through widespread online denunciation leading to loss of career or status. These modern phenomena are in many ways undeniably clear echoes amplified by instantaneous global communication of that ancient human impulse across diverse cultures to publicly identify, denounce, and sometimes utterly disgrace individuals deemed to have violated prevailing norms, whether moral, social, political, or ethical. It seems that the deeply ingrained human desire to point at someone who has crossed a line and publicly proclaim, "Naughty, you are naughty, and we all see it," has fundamentally not gone away. It has merely found new, often incredibly rapid and wide-reaching technological avenues for its expression. This particular realization might make you feel a newfound appreciation for the privacy settings available on your own digital devices and platforms. As you now begin to reflect quietly on this vast, intense, and often profoundly unsettling journey through the bizarre and undeniably brutal landscapes of historical punishments across continents and centuries, remembering the unique, often horrifying, and incredibly varied ways humanity has approached enforcing rules. From Aztec sacrifices meant to preserve cosmic order and brutal executions based on social rank to the specific, sometimes animal-inclusive horrors of Roman legal penalties like the sack for patricide, the excruciating, drawn-out, and anatomically specific brutality of medieval hanging, drawing, and quartering, the public bodily punishments, and deliberate mutilations of ancient Egypt meant to reflect the crime, the systematic regulated pain of judicial caning in East Asian bureaucracies, alongside collective punishments and terrifyingly precise executions, and the almost universal, often psychologically devastating use of public shaming rituals like stocks, pillories, and distinguishing marks found in cultures worldwide to expose and humiliate offenders. You come to realize how profoundly varied, how relentlessly inventive, often in the worst possible ways, and how frequently outright horrifying humanity has shown itself to be, in its diverse attempts throughout time to establish order, delineate right from wrong, deter potential transgressors, and mete out consequences for those who violated the established rules. These are not just dusty, disconnected facts pulled from ancient books or historical archives. They are vibrant, though often dark and painful glimpses into the core values, deep-seated fears, powerful hierarchies, and fundamental structures of human societies that were vastly, undeniably different from our own present-day existence. They serve as a powerful, stark, and often humbling reminder of just how far our concepts of justice, of fairness, of inherent human dignity, and of appropriate consequences have thankfully evolved in many parts of the world over the vast stretches of time we've just traversed, even if that lingering, instinctive urge to cast a disapproving look, feel a moment of outrage, or maybe just mentally point and say naughty towards someone who cuts carelessly in line at the store still perhaps occasionally fleetingly crosses our own minds. That human impulse towards social regulation, judgment, and expressing disapproval seems deeply ingrained, but the formal methods employed have changed profoundly. And now, as the vivid images of Aztec plazas, Egyptian temples and their judges, Roman amphitheaters, medieval gallows and pillories, and the structured markets and courts of East Asia, images populated by officials with stern faces, figures in stocks facing public scorn, and the faint, unsettling sounds of historical forms of correction. As these detailed, intense historical scenarios slowly and gradually begin to soften, to fade, and finally, thankfully, to dissolve from your mind, it's truly time now to let your mind genuinely finally drift towards rest. We have explored some profoundly intense, often difficult, and undeniably harsh history tonight. We have journeyed through worlds governed by very severe rules and enforced by even harsher consequences, realities that are challenging to truly grasp from our perspective. But that complex, often terrifying historical world we explored tonight is now far, far away from you. It is separated not only by centuries of elapsed time, by vast continental distances, but critically by the secure physical space and hopefully the comfortable bed chair or peaceful place you are snuggled up in listening right now. You can consciously, deliberately let go of the bustling sounds of those ancient markets, the foreign languages, the shouts, the commerce. Let them fade. Release the dry heat of the Egyptian desert or the organized stone of Rome from your senses. Let go of the damp chill of medieval stone, the fear in a marketplace facing potential shaming, the starkness of ancient methods of correction. They were simply stories tonight, images woven into a narrative for your mind to wander through and explore from a position of safety and observation. They are no longer a present reality you need to navigate. Feel the comforting, familiar weight of the blankets around you. Feel the softness of your pillow beneath your head. Listen quietly now, just to the gentle, calming rhythm of your own breathing. Notice the soft, ambient sounds of the modern night outside your window or the steady, unobtrusive hum of a fan, sounds of your own peaceful environment. All those heavy worries about whether you might accidentally trigger ancient Aztec adultery laws with a misstep, or be subject to bizarre Roman punishments, like the sack and animals, or fear being spotted for minor gossip in a society where it mattered deeply. All those specific historical fears can now just simply float away from you. Allow them to dissipate like mist clearing in the morning sun. They do not belong here in this quiet, safe, and protected space you have deliberately created for yourself in this modern time and place. Your body is still now. Your mind is calm and released from its journey. There is absolutely nowhere else you need to be right now, and fundamentally, there is nothing specific or urgent you need to actively do. Just be present in this moment of quiet and safety. Let the thoughts of distant historical punishments, the grim methods, the severe rules, and the difficult realities simply melt away like snow dissolving into water. You are safe. You are warm. You are undeniably completely here in your own time. Just allow peace to settle around you now. Let sleep come gently, easily when it is ready for you, like a soft, dark wave washing over you, pulling you into comfortable rest after our long journey through history tonight. Sleep well.